Hello, we're ready to go. Thank you for joining us for today's summit, Making Nature Investable. My name's Jane Gilbert. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs and Communications for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. I prefer to call myself the Chief Storyteller for our organization, and we have great stories to tell. I'll be your MC today. Before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors, TD Ready Commitment and the Packard Foundation. Together, they have helped to make this event possible, so our sincere thanks to our sponsors today. We're being joined by people from around the world, and you might actually experience a few technical glitches as we continue with the summit today. We expect if you do, it will be temporary. Thank you in advance for your patience. If you do run into any issues, you can reach out to our technical support team. You can access the help desk option on the top left-hand menu of the event platform. Now, today's summit is being recorded. We'll be sharing a link to the recording later this week, so keep an eye on your inboxes for that. We invite you to ask questions during our panel discussion sections today. You'll notice a question and answer chat box will be available during those sessions. If you think of a question for the speakers at any point, just type it in there, include who the question is intended for, and we will answer them at the end of the panel discussions. Okay, so that's the housekeeping out of the way. At this time, I'd like to get down to business. We'd like to introduce the Nature Conservancy of Canada's President and CEO, Catherine Grenier. Catherine, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jane. Hello, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. I'd like to start by acknowledging that as we come together today, we're all on Indigenous land. I'm speaking to you from Quebec City in the territory of the Huron-Wendat people. And the Nature Conservancy of Canada respectfully acknowledges that the work we do across the country encompasses the territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. On behalf of the Nature Conservancy of Canada, thank you for being part of making nature investable. We have attendees from across Canada and from far beyond our borders. In fact, there's well over 1,000 people that have registered for today's conversation. So we're really pleased to welcome each and every one of you. For those who don't know the Nature Conservancy of Canada, we call ourselves NCC for short. We're unique. We make conservation happen, not just for today, but for the future. NCC is a unifying force, brokering solutions through dynamic collaborations between private and public partners, working alongside Indigenous people. We offer opportunities for everyone, Canadians from all walks of life, to do their part and join in to protect and care for nature. Together, we've conserved more than 14 million hectares from coast to coast to coast. That's roughly the size of Greece for those that are still struggling with hectares, like me. It's the habitat of more than a third of Canadian species at risk, and most are in our backyards. In fact, 93% of Canadians live within an hour drive of NCC conservation area. The impact of our work is real, sizable, and permanent. At NCC, as you will see today, we are determined to build a better world where people and nature thrive. And let's face it, especially now, we all need more nature in our lives. In the face of biodiversity loss and climate change, what we often refer as the twin crisis, or the most demanding challenge of our time, the first and most affordable solution is to conserve and care for natural places that support us. The forests, grasslands, and peatlands that absorb and store carbon, the wetlands that clean our drinking water. Nature protects communities from disease, flood, fire, extreme weather, and other impact of climate change. From the food on our tables to our health and well-being, nature is our life support system. And for all it does, it is still largely undervalued. Delivering on the ground, conservation is what we do every day. But we know Canada and the world needs way more. How do we accelerate conservation and stimulate investment to advance nature-based solution, that's where our conversation begins today. So we're delighted to launch our summit by introducing Canada's Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, the Honourable Jonathan Wilkinson. Since 2015, he has been the Member of Parliament representing North Vancouver. Prior to his current portfolio, he served as Minister of Fisheries and Ocean in the Canadian Coast Guard. And before taking public office, he was a leader in the clean tech sector. But above all, Minister Wilkinson, born in Ontario, raised in Saskatchewan, and an avid paddler, is a true leader and a strong voice for nature, our biggest ally. So, Minister Wilkinson, welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be with you today.
We're really pleased to have that conversation with you. We often hear the phrase nature positive and carbon neutral. That's our opportunity, our goal, I would say our responsibility, an equitable, nature positive, and carbon neutral future. What does that phrase mean to you?
Well, I think at the highest level, it effectively means that we've made peace with nature. We, as you just said, we are faced with the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. They are obviously inextricably interlinked. But I think that what that phrase describes is achieving a healthy state where we've essentially stabilized biodiversity and have started to see growth back towards health, towards a more healthy dynamic, and that we've achieved a space on the climate side where we are not adding to the problem, where we actually have at least got to the point where we've stabilized the rise in global average temperature to something that, well, not great, it will be at least somewhat manageable. And obviously then we work to do better. But I think that's what that phrase means to me.
Excellent. I've heard you say many times how Canada must lead in this space, how as a G7 country we are industrial emitters, but how we're also home to some of the world's largest carbon stores. How does that frame our approach to these challenges, our responsibility and opportunity? How do we act as a world leader in that space?
Well, I think there's probably a few different ways. I mean, I think Canada does have both opportunities and responsibilities. I mean, as you noted, Canada is one of the few places in this world where we still have vast wild spaces. And while we certainly have challenges with respect to species at risk and the ongoing challenges of finding ways to balance industrial development and conservation, we are one of the few places that still has those wild remaining landscapes. And I think that puts a significant responsibility on a country like Canada to think about how to protect that, because once those things are gone, they're gone. But I also think it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for Canadians to ensure that we are actually focused on protecting some elements of what I think helps to define many of us as Canadians. I think those wild spaces and those wild animals are integral to our whole concept of being a Canadian. And so I think we have a lot of opportunity to do that, but I think we've got to be very thoughtful about how we go about it. And one of the things that I do think that we kind of need to disaggregate a little bit more, and that sometimes we get mixed up, is there are kind of two orders. There is the order of thinking about the protection of those spaces that have large carbon pools, that have significant biodiversity, that remain largely intact ecosystems. And that is about protection and conservation. It's a more challenging discussion in terms of mobilizing finance, and that's probably something we can talk about. And then there's the second order, which is about restoration. It's about actually building back in areas where we have caused damage that needs to be restored. And that can be for the purpose of sequestering carbon through trees and wetlands and those kinds of things. But it also can be simply about protecting and enhancing the species that live there, and in particular species at risk, like the boreal caribou. And that, again, is about trees, and it's about wetlands, and it's about all of those kinds of things. So I think we need to be thoughtful about it, and we need to think about those two problems a little bit separately, because I think the prescriptions as to how you address them may be different.
Can you elaborate a bit more on that in terms of the prescriptions and the difference you see with the two different areas?
Sure. I mean, the restoration conversation is something that is perhaps easier, and I think you'll probably hear more about some of the increasing discussion around financing mechanisms when you talk to Mark Carney later today. But with respect to restoration and those kinds of things, you can figure out reasonably easy how to monetize those in the context of the existing architecture of Paris, for example, through things like offsets and those kinds of things, where you can actually think about a business case associated with restoring habitat, so that it's not just relying on government funding, which will certainly not be enough, irrespective of how much we commit. And this government has committed a lot, but it will not be enough. And it goes beyond philanthropic money, which is very important and has been very important in the successes of the nature legacy. But again, not sufficient. I think, but that bite-sized piece is one that I think people are figuring out increasingly. But I think the issue around how do you protect these intact landscapes when there is no easy way to monetize, to create a business case for that, it is harder. And right now that is falling to governments and philanthropic organizations. And I think the great challenge for many of us is going to be figuring out how you create the kinds of incentives that will enable private capital to come in and help us with that task in a way that's consistent, obviously, with preserving these spaces.
Yeah, well, that's actually interesting. We know we need those incentives, but to what extent could private investment in market-based approaches further help Canada achieve its ambitious goal for biodiversity conservation? So what do you see can help stimulate it and make it happen?
Well, I think, first of all, having a greater degree of international commonality about how you think about offsets, for example, and the rules to ensure that there is transparency and accountability, and that offsets are measured, and that they're only counted once, and that they're real, and all of those kinds of things are going to be critical in terms of being able to scale work in this area. And again, this is probably more applicable to this restoration piece of things. So I think that would be number one. Number two is, domestically, we have to think about how we can create those kinds of incentives. So the Environment Climate Change Canada has just recently put out a number of different offset protocols to try to start that conversation. Obviously, this is going to require not just one-offs, it's going to require some degree of scale. But I do think these kinds of financial instruments are things that we need to be evolving and evolving our thinking. I know there are many private organizations in this country and elsewhere that have a great interest in this conversation. But I would repeat that, as I said before, I think this part of it is a conversation that is ongoing, and we need to push it forward, and we need to think about scale. I think the other order, though, around intact landscapes is a conversation that perhaps we're not having as much as we're going to need to on a go-forward basis.
Agreed. So you've talked a bit about offset, but can you share more about the federal government's view on the role that carbon offset may play in terms of Canada achieving its carbon ambition as well as net zero goals, as well as a nature positive future?
Well, I mean, offsets are important I think in the context of trying to think about how you leverage different pools of capital. As I said before, this government has been very committed to thinking about how do you actually create these protected spaces. And that's both in these intact areas, but it's also about actually in areas of biodiversity where you're going to have to do some restoration work. And of course, you saw a recent redoubling of that commitment in the budget that came out a few weeks ago. We've also said that nature-based solutions are going to be very important going forward. We've got the 2 billion tree commitment and the wetlands and grasslands work and funding that's underway to do work that's important from a sequestration perspective, but to be honest, has co-benefits also for biodiversity around various kinds of species, but certainly things like caribou. But as I said before, the governments will need help. This is a big task. And I don't think that you're going to find that there's sufficient capital within governments or within philanthropic organizations to do all the things that we really want and need to do. And so figuring out how to scale through mechanisms like offsets, and there probably are a range of other financial concepts that are being debated and discussed, that can help us to do that. But at the end of the day, we're going to need to find ways to incent private capital if we're going to scale these kinds of solutions in the context of restoration. We're also going to need private capital in the context of conservation and protection of these broader areas where we would prefer not to see industrialization.
Great, and I hope that a lot of conversation today will give us some ideas in terms of practical examples. You've spoken about the view of the federal government, the role of the public to support or incentivize private sector, but how do you see various levels of government can work together to more effectively scale up the investment that are needed?
Well, I guess, we're talking about both the issues around climate and biodiversity. I think we have been very much encouraging provinces, territories, and municipalities to engage the climate conversation. And certainly some have been, at the provincial level, have been leaders. I would point to Quebec and to British Columbia and Nova Scotia in particular. And certainly the cities across this country have been massive advocates for climate action and have been strong partners with the federal government. On the biodiversity side, I will tell you that it's a bit of a more challenging conversation at times. Provinces are obviously a lot closer to resource rents, and the conflict is often around resource extraction and the manner in which it's done vis-a-vis spaces that exist and species. And so finding ways to ensure that we are moving forward collaboratively in the context of nature agreements and other mechanisms is going to be really important. I think one of the things that has really catalyzed action at some provincial levels with climate has been the mobilization of the public. I don't think we're remotely close to that on biodiversity. I think that's one of the things that organizations like yours need to think about how they do more of is convincing Canadians that this really should be a priority for governments in this country, whether they are municipal, provincial, or federal. And I do think that it's important that we collectively are thinking about this in a manner that recognizes the nature of Canada, where most of us live in these pockets at the southern parts of the country. What we need to do with respect to nature is going to be different in different parts of the country, and that's why we've kind of developed this whole approach around three regions of Canada. The southern region, which is really about protection around ecological corridors, creating urban parks, trying to actually ensure people have access to nature. A mid-Canada strategy, which is really trying to reconcile development, industrial development, vis-a-vis the need for protection and conservation. And then, of course, a northern strategy, which is about some of these large intact spaces that we really should be thinking about how to protect for future generations. And we engage provinces and territories and municipalities in that conversation pretty much every day of the week.
And I mean, you've highlighted the need to raise awareness, or I guess reach the hearts and minds of Canadians about the importance of biodiversity and how we need to act now. Any advice for organizations like us in terms of how do we believe so strongly that nature is critical to our well-being, but any advice as to how we bring all of Canadians with us in that challenge?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, when people ask me that question about climate change, my answer often is, have young people talk to older people, because young people really understand the looming threat for their future, and they are the best ambassadors to convince their parents and their grandparents and their aunts and uncles and their neighbors that this should be a priority for them as well. With respect to biodiversity, it's a little bit more challenging because, as you know, we are an increasingly urban society, and I think relative to previous generations, we probably have, on aggregate, less exposure to nature. And so I think there's a couple of things. I mean, I think one element is we have to strive to figure out how we engage an increasingly urbanized population in nature, how we give them exposure and experience with nature. that is fundamentally the idea behind this network of national urban parks and ecological corridors, is to try to ensure that people can have that kind of access. I think you worked on the establishment of Rouge National Park. That's exactly what Rouge is about. I also think that you need to find symbols that essentially resonate with people. And I think those symbols are can be different in different parts of the country. I think for many people, it's animals, right? It's the majestic caribou. It's the southern resident killer whale. It's those kinds of things that people understand when you talk about those species being threatened, that something has to be done to address the ecosystems around them. And I also think it's increasingly trying to find ways to amplify the voices of Indigenous Canadians who speak to this issue in a way I think that resonates when people hear it, resonates very fundamentally about thinking forward in terms of the future that you are going to leave, not just to the next generation, but to 7 generations in the future. So, I think it's a conversation that we need to think about how we actually focus it in a way that people will hear it, they will understand it, and they fundamentally will feel it. And that will translate into pressure on all governments to take the kind of action that they need to take.
Absolutely. And I think if we think of the program we've been managing together for many years, the Natural Heritage Conservation Program, which is exactly that, right? How do we bring a wide diversity of Canadian private partners, landowners, local land trusts to work with government to actually achieve some of those biodiversity targets? So what are other examples, or do you have any thoughts as to how do we amplify these types of programs so this voluntary conservation or this voluntary support gets amplified in this country?
Well, I mean, there's some of the things that I think, as you will know quite well, have been ongoing for a while, and I think we'll need to ramp up. Things like the Learn to Camp programs and nature programming in the schools, that I think we can figure out how to try to actually build upon that in the context of some of the work that we will be doing with respect to urban parks, for example, and those kinds of things. I do think that finding ways to bring nature more proximate to people is increasingly important, as I say, in an increasingly urbanized society and in a society that has large-scale immigration to this country. We need to ensure that nature is front and center to people who may live and move to Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal. If it is that we want them to prioritize the protection of nature as something that's of particular importance to them, and that they will express that to their governments. So I think, we are doing some of those things, but we are always open to new ideas in terms of how we accelerate that. I do think finding ways to get people out into natural environments is key to actually being able to convince people of the value, not just the economic value around ecosystem services, but the value, the majesty that exists when you're actually out in nature. I was very fortunate growing up. I grew up in Saskatchewan, and my father had a small canoeing outfitting business in the north, far in the north, in the boreal forest. And so I used to spend 4 or 5 months of the year in the boreal forest, in an area that is completely still intact. It's an ecosystem that is still in balance, where you will see bears and boreal caribou and a whole range of different things on any given day. And certainly for me, that experience has shaped very much how I think about these things. I think we need to ensure that we're trying to give other people, all people, some ability to experience that.
Yes, absolutely. And I think what we could say is there's probably, although we think of Canada as a large country with tons of nature, these opportunities are still not available to everybody, right? So we still need more places for people to be able to experience that nature firsthand. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I certainly agree with you. As I say, I think we are always open to ideas as to how we actually amplify some of the work that we are trying to do. I will tell you that the folks who work at Parks Canada think about this every day. Parks Canada is one of the great jewels of the Canadian government. But it can't be the case that you have to go from Vancouver to Banff to experience what it's like to be out in nature. We have to be striving on an ongoing basis to think about how we actually bring that closer to people. Because ultimately, if it's not closer to people, people aren't going to care enough about it to make it a priority. And ultimately, if you're going to make the kind of progress that we need to make in a country that, while we have large wild spaces and while we still, relative to many countries in the world, have an abundance of nature, we have almost 700 species that are either listed or about to be listed under the Species at Risk Act. We have challenges, and we need people to care enough for governments to make investments and to sometimes make the hard decisions to ensure that we are protecting and ultimately reversing some of the damage that we have done.
Absolutely. And I think, as you said, we have challenges, but I like to think that we have huge responsibility as such a large country and an immense opportunity to bring different people together to actually make it happen. Because in Canada, we still have that chance, right? Most countries in the world no longer have that chance, right? Restoration is pretty much what's left. For us, we have the opportunity, as you say, to do both the protection of what's intact as well as the restoration to improve the health of our country. You've highlighted many opportunities, and I think it will inspire a wide range of partners, especially the thousands that are with us today, to get involved. Because really, that's about it, right? The conversation today is how do we get more people involved to solve those challenges? Because I'm really confident optimist. I think we could do it. I'm convinced, but we need more people convinced. I guess. Let me ask you, what do you really want us to take away from this conversation? If you had a couple of strong advice or prescription for Canadians and for partners that are with us today, what is it that we need to do, Minister Wilkinson?
Well, I guess I would probably say two things. The first is I know that the focus of some of the discussions that you will be having here are on financing. And how do you think about financing in the context of some of these discussions around conservation and protection? And I would encourage you to in the course of those discussions, to separate out and to talk perhaps about the prescriptions that are most relevant to restoration and separately to those that are really focused on conservation of intact spaces, because I honestly do think that they are not the same. And to be honest, I think the financing issues around conservation of intact spaces is more challenging than the restoration piece. And so I think that's something that hopefully folks will keep in mind as we go forward. The other thing I would just say is the government is not the fount of all wisdom, and we don't know everything, and we are not always the most creative. No disrespect to the government of Canada, but we need help. We need ideas, creative ideas from folks about how we can do better, how we can engage Canadians more effectively. Creative ideas about things that perhaps we should be thinking about on the financing side or in other areas. Creative ideas about how we can mobilize other levels of government. So I would just encourage everybody to be at cause in terms of bringing forward those ideas and engaging those conversations. We are very, and certainly I am, very open to engaging those conversations with you and with others on the line today. That's how we make progress, is not operating in silos, but having discussions and debates.
Absolutely. Well, Minister Wilkinson, I can assure you that at the Nature Conservancy of Canada, we're happy to have those conversations. We're eager and ready to elevate the game, to bring more people in the tent, to make it happen, to do our part, and bring our partners to the table for nature. So, Minister Wilkinson, I'm very grateful that you're with us today for this really important conversation. Thank you for sharing your views, your advice, your wise thought, and we truly appreciate your leadership for Canada and for the world, for nature. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Excellent. Now that we talked about the importance of nature-based solutions, the opportunity for Canada, the importance of mobilizing more people in our cause, I think it's time to look at what does success look like. We asked our next panel to weigh the opportunity and challenges and sketch a picture for us of winning project. You know, these concrete examples that are showing us that we really can make it happen. That are moving us away from just talks, right? Taking nature-based solution in actual real terms. So together, the experts will be bringing along, share a wealth of real-world experience, building the business case for investment in nature-based solution. With example drawn from Canada and internationally, they'll focus on creative solutions that have the potential to be applied at scale. So our moderator for this session is Peter Stein, the managing director at the Lime Timber. Whenever you're ready, Peter.
Well, great. Thank you for that introduction, Catherine. It was great to listen to your minister as well. So I am Peter Stein. I'm one of the managing directors of Lime Timber. Lime Timber has had the pleasure over the last decade or so, or a little more, of having done two very significant conservation investments in partnership with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, one in the Eastern Townships and one in the southwest corner of Quebec. The panel we put together is truly globe spanning, and we will have folks from Canada, from Australia, from the west coast of the US, and from the east coast of the US. I have to admit that we even were able to recruit an Australian panelist who was born in Canada. So we really want to make sure there's a homegrown connection within the panel. What we hope to do is really have a pretty candid conversation. Each panelist will describe what caused them to get into this field of work, and then a little bit about their actual business activities. And then we'll have a conversation about how they actually produce durable conservation and restoration on the ground. We'll look at various offsetting schemes, at blended finance schemes. We'll be talking about carbon. We'll be talking about interim financing that's provided by both governments and philanthropies. And we'll be talking about how those things come together to address both climate change through nature-based solutions and biodiversity protection. So I just wanted all of you to know a little bit more about why in the world Rob Wilson recruited me to do this. First of all, he's a nice guy. Second, in addition to my day job at Lime Timber, I am the co-founder of two networks. One is called the Conservation Finance Network. We run an annual conservation finance boot camp, and we've had a number of the staff of Nature Conservancy of Canada attend that boot camp, which takes place at various universities around the US. Second is I'm a co-founder of something called the International Land Conservation Network, which has had a lot of engagement with Nature Conservancy of Canada, particularly as NCC has helped recatalyze the network of local and regional land trusts in Canada. So those may be some of the reasons, but probably the last is I've been doing this either for a very long time or some of my professionals, colleagues would say for too long a time, in that I started my career at an NGO called the Trust for Public Land and migrated over to the dark side, the private sector, so to speak, because there was never enough money just in philanthropy and just in public agency funds to accomplish land conservation at the so-called landscape scale. So for the last almost 30 years, I've been working at that scale. And just to give you a few metrics, Lime Timber has been involved in about 1,125,000 acres worth of working forest conservation easements and working forest conservation servitudes. That means the forest lands that we invest in will perpetually be forests because of these perpetual restrictions that we have negotiated in partnership with conservation NGOs like NCC and state and federal agencies, both in the US and in Canada. Secondly, we've done about 400,000 acres worth of improved forest management offset carbon transactions, all for the regulated market in California. Another mechanism to monetize ecosystem services that delivers durable conservation. So, with that intro, I would like to first welcome Karen Clark Whistler, currently a principal at ESG Global Advisors, but many of you in Canada and from other parts of the world will know her as sort of the lead environmental director at TD Bank for the previous decade. So Karen.
Thank you very much, Peter, and I'm so delighted to be here today. Peter asked all of us on this committee or on this fireside chat to ask them what has personally motivated them to be in nature-based solutions. And to be honest, it was really thought-provoking. I hadn't thought about it before, but when I did think about it, I guess the answer to me was I've always been interested in the links between the environment and the economy. And having trained as an applied ecologist almost 30 years ago, for most of my career, I heard that you had to make a choice between protecting the environment or damaging the economy, or choosing the environment or choosing jobs. And it was interesting because, the economic value of nature in that equation was always expressed in terms of cost of compliance, impacts to the bottom line, or competitive disadvantage. Whereas the ecological value was largely expressed in terms of feelings, such as appreciation of beauty, or sadness, of loss, or paving paradise. However, I always believed that a strong economy and a strong environment went hand in hand, and thank goodness the world is finally catching up with me. When I joined TD Bank in 2009 as Chief Environment Officer, I had a fantastic opportunity to start working on putting a financial value on nature. And how might you do that? We developed and purchased a number of different types of nature-based carbon offsets, paying about $10 to $25 a ton to prevent a ton of CO2-filled hot air. At the time, our chief economist, Don Drummond, published an infamous report in 2010 predicting that carbon pricing would not only happen, but that the price would escalate to $130 a ton. And we also formed collaborative partnerships with groups such as NCC, where we brought scientists and economists together to put a value on nature by quantifying the value of ecological services provided by NCC properties, by urban forests and green spaces. And we found that those values were substantial, being on the order of $20,000 a hectare. So I'm delighted that our work over the past decade has gotten us to where we are today, which is holding a serious thought leadership event where the words nature and investment occur in the same sentence. And I'll look forward to exploring that further.
Hi, everyone, and greetings from Sydney, Australia at about 3:30 in the morning. Pleasure to be here with you. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not an Australian. I am from Toronto. I grew up in Toronto and did a forestry degree and worked in Canada for many years. I did a PhD at UBC looking at ecophysiology of forests, and I was a scientist in the late 1980s. It was an interesting time with just the start of recognition of the potential role of forests and the carbon cycle and acid rain issues and looking at regeneration after timber harvesting. A lot of big environmental issues, and moved into Ottawa in 1990 around the time of the Earth Summit. We had a big green plan in Canada that was starting to look at climate change and sustainable development in forestry. And then I took an intergovernmental exchange to Australia, and the first thing they asked me to do was to redesign the regulatory system for logging natural forests. And being a kind of a dumb Canadian that came in from outside and was asked to figure out this highly controversial area, what struck me was here we were kind of logging was what the purpose was, and everything else was a constraint, whether it be biodiversity or climate or fresh water. And I realized this actually needs to be flipped on its head. I mean, these environmental values, conservation and carbon stocks, these need to become the objectives. And I formed the view at that point, after being in sort of science and public policy, that if we're going to make change in the world, we need to change how capital flows, how we think about investment and what we're investing in. And so in the middle of my career, I decided to switch into investment management. I spent 5 years learning the ropes in a firm, and then started New Forests, a company in 2005 that would try to invest in forests for more than timber production, for the whole suite of attributes, whether that be for climate mitigation, biodiversity conservation, or other values. And we started, it was a very small business with 4 people. And today we manage 1 million hectares across 6 countries: Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Laos, and the United States. We have about 6.5 billion Canadian dollars in assets under management, principally from pension plans and reinsurance companies, medical benefits trusts. And we have, had a core forestry investment business, but throughout all that, we have continuously tried to explore and push the boundaries of what the forestry sector can be seen as, looking at multiple carbon market exposures. We've tried wetlands mitigation banks, endangered species banks. We did a biodiversity bank in Sabah and Borneo. So we have, over the years, built up, I think, a track record of looking at how we can bring private capital into areas of conservation finance, balancing production and conservation in landscapes.
Thanks, everybody. Pleasure to be here today. My name is Eric Letzinger. I'm the CEO of a company called Quantified Ventures. We are an outcomes-based capital firm. It's kind of a mouthful. We operate under the principle that if we're going to expect our public sector leaders to innovate up the big mountain that they're trying to get up, related to all the issues that are being discussed here today, we're going to have to give them new tools to pay for things if we're going to expect them to choose innovation over business as usual. In order to do that, we think the simplest way to get at that is to start to enable public sector leaders to purchase outcomes. And at least here in the United States, most of it, and I've spent a third of my career running municipal agencies, the way we pay for everything is on the front end, and we take all the risk and we kind of hope for the best. If we can flip that and start to enable, through different innovative financial mechanisms, government leaders to purchase the outcomes associated with initiatives that are deemed more innovative, and generally what that comes down to is nature-based solutions, upstream, downstream, to solve some of the vexing challenges that governments are building more gray infrastructure to resolve. We'd like them to be choosing more nature-based solutions, right? So we operate in the forestry sector, where we're using these financial structures to enable reforestation on abandoned mines, to address wildfires in Colorado. We've got a robust agriculture practice where we're paying farmers to profitably, that's the key word there, profitably build conservation practices on their farms that yield sequestered carbon that we can sell on the back end of the growing season, as well as water quality benefits in terms of the phosphorus and nitrates not getting off of their farms and getting into the waterways and going downstream to where water authorities are having to make significant investments on their water treatment facilities that they'd rather not be making. We're able to use that mechanism to pay farmers to build those conservation practices and then sell the outcomes to 3 levels of government here in the United States, both municipalities, with state departments of agriculture and also with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We also address, through these outcomes-based mechanisms, stormwater challenges in urban areas. Most municipalities who are having to address this massive and growing challenge in their cities are facing that classic challenge of, do I build more gray infrastructure, or do I consider this green infrastructure, more nature-based solutions? The nature-based solutions typically get put in that category of innovative, whether it's perceived or real risk. That's where we typically step in and try to structure these outcome-based financial mechanisms that make it a rational choice for that municipal leader to choose the nature-based solution over the gray infrastructure solution, by enabling them to purchase more of the outcomes associated with the green infrastructure. Looking forward to a good conversation today. Looking forward to learning from everybody. These are early days for all of these financial mechanisms. We're thrilled with the momentum that we have, but we got a lot to learn from all of you. And this is a fun field to be in. It's a little wild, wild west. Welcome to the wild, wild west.
Wonderful. Thank you to the Nature Conservancy for having me. And I think I'll follow up Eric's and talk a little bit about the Wild West, at least in the United States. I'm based in California, so we'll ask us to think and talk a little bit about why this is important to us. It's pretty obvious in California. Our entire state burns. It gets worse every year that we see it. And coming from, I knew that what we would need is a finance solution to a problem like the last panel in from Peter, that there just isn't enough financing at the public or philanthropic sector to solve these problems. So how do we create things that can bring more capital to this problem? In solving the wildfire problem, it's not just about making sure our homes don't burn or protecting habitat. It's really about the water we drink and use for agricultural purposes. It's about the air quality, and something we've been talking a lot about in the United States is jobs, with infrastructure coming right around the corner. So at the full conservation, these things together is by saying initial vehicle just is there in our force facilities with all this leadership, the sources, and all the resources too. And behind this was use private capital to accelerate the pace and scale of restoration, stop these catastrophic wildfire, while protecting air quality losses, and other things of that nature. We then allow all from this work to pay investors back over time based on the benefits they receive. That could be federal agencies, it could be state agencies, it could be local municipalities, or even private companies. And I think I'll finish the thoughts with here that's really unique about our work is that we don't own or purchase land.
I wonder if I could just jump in for a second. We seem to be having some audio issues. So we'll go to the full panel now, and if we could just, we'll work on the audio issue in the background. And I think, Peter, if you can maybe start with some of the questions. Sorry to cut you off. Sorry to jump in.
Well, I am sure we will fix Zach so that we can all hear him loud and clearly. Well, first, we have a bunch of questions that I would like to socialize across the panel and get quick responses to the extent that you want from each of the panelists. Lime timber has benefited indirectly, well, we've benefited two ways from philanthropy. A number of foundation endowments invest with us, so we put their capital to work directly in our investments, so we deploy their capital. But secondly, a number of foundations have made what are in the States described as program-related investments to nonprofits who we've partnered with. This actually happened in the case of one of our deals with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and that those loans have then been shared with us, but we correspondingly provide an option to the loan maker, in this case it was the Nature Conservancy of Canada, that earns them the rights to acquire certain conservation interests in the future. But each of you have different experiences with philanthropy, and I thought maybe starting with David, even though it's very early in the morning with David, he's still on. I make him do this a lot, actually. Someday I will talk to David when it's like business hours in Australia, but it hasn't happened yet. But maybe, David, you could share the role that Packard is playing in your new fund. I thought that would be a quick but really interesting thing to share.
Sure. Yeah, and I guess in some ways getting up at 3:30 is not as bad as jet lag. But anyway, yeah, the Packard Foundation, we sat down with them a couple of years ago and started to have a conversation about our investment strategy in Southeast Asia. There's really important biodiversity values there. There's really important climate mitigation opportunities. There's significant, rural economic development opportunities. And so what they negotiated with us was to create a new structure in our new Southeast Asian Forestry Fund that would be a form of blended finance. And the idea would be that the fund would have two compartments, a Class A and a Class B. The Class A would be your traditional investors looking for a risk-adjusted return, maybe 14, 15%. And then you would have the Class B, which would be high-impact investors. And half of the capital that they contributed would be dedicated into sort of high biodiversity enhancement projects, carbon-related restoration, community development projects. And that would be embedded in the larger landscapes of production and conservation activities. And that fund now is moving towards a closing. It's really interesting. We've got significant investment in both sides of that. And interestingly, a corporate has gone into the B side as well, and they've negotiated the rights to buy the climate mitigation out of the whole investment vehicle. So you get this kind of synergistic investment structure where the traditional investors are getting a high sustainability outcome, but with also a waterfall that gives them a preferred return. And then you have the impact investors that are getting their impact spread across a much bigger portfolio of investments.
Great. So, Eric, if I could turn to you quickly, there have been a number of concessionary debt providers to various projects that some of which I actually know about at Quantified Ventures. So.
Sure. Hey, Philanthropy has played a significant role in the development of a lot of our financial mechanisms and outcomes funds that we built. The realities are the pre-development work associated with taking the idea from the whiteboard in the conference room out into the field and learning pretty quickly how wrong you got it on the pretty whiteboard in your conference room. It takes some dogged determination. It also takes time, and it also takes money to fail that often. We fail quite a bit at Quantified Ventures. That's a big part of our culture. We lean into pretty big stuff. And to Peter's point, we've been quite fortunate to have strong philanthropic partners who, based on our track record, are willing to grant fund some of our pre-development work as we lean into new use cases. And to David's point, the process tends to go grant funding to work through the toil of figuring it out, get pretty close to figuring it out, starts to stress test the capital through that model, through concessionary PRIs and other type of foundation-supported investments, and then starting to graduate to various tiers of impact investors, and as we move towards scale. We get a lot of calls from a lot of big investment houses who are wishing we could move faster to scale. And I just want to give a big shout out for those willing to participate at the less glamorous end of that cycle, which is out in the field with helmets on, failing miserably. But without one, you don't get the other.
Great. Well, Karen, maybe I can make you put your current hat on for a moment and talk through a little bit about the growth of green financing, particularly green bonds, and how that meshes or potentially meshes with the corporate commitments of net zero?
Sure, that's great. Thank you very much. I guess my work now is really very focused on how do we bring more mainstream capital funding through global capital markets into this nature-based solution space. So just trying to figure out how to answer the question. I mean, I think, first of all, it's quite useful for people maybe to clarify what we actually mean when we talk about attracting mainstream global funding, because we're talking quite a lot, and we'll hear a lot today about carbon offsets, but there really are many, many vehicles. And so maybe I'll just touch on all of them before maybe getting a bit more specific. But, first of all, capital markets are global. They include banks, institutional investors, asset owners, pension plans, insurance companies, retail investors, as well as corporations. So there are many folks who can bring money into the system. And this funding can take many forms. It could be investing in shares in companies that demonstrate a tangible commitment to developing nature-based solutions, investing in bonds issued by both the public sector as well as the private sector. It can include, as we've heard already, creating commodity markets for trading carbon offsets or other nature-based offsets. It could include tax and R&D incentives, or creating corporate lending products that reward companies for undertaking actions that result in development of nature-based solutions. And it can also include creating commercial and retail banking products that reward folks like you and I for putting our money towards conservation or restoration. The great news is that all of these products currently exist in some form for financing of green and sustainable investing. They just need to be adapted to incorporate nature-based solutions. So I might stop there. I can get more specific, but don't want to share the stage.
Well, Zach, I've been following your work since about day one of Blue Forest Conservation, and I'm a big fan. And if we had a fairer or better world, in the case of some of the work you do, governments would be paying for it at the federal level. But as you well know, from a lot of pain and scars and bruises, that's a hard thing to do. But you have innovated in finding other payers. And I thought you could address that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely, Peter. And again, thanks for having me, and apologies for any of the technical issues that I had first time around chatting here. So yeah, one of the things we realized
because you compete with Eric, sometimes I think he screwed up your. No, Peter. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it could be a little bit of that, but no, I don't think he's controlling the internet here. So one of the things, Peter, that we realized was there wasn't a meaningful solution on public land. And if you look at our Forest Service in the United States, we have about an $80 billion backlog of restoration, and the agency can spend anywhere between $500 million and $1 billion a year on that type of work, meaning that we've got a 100-year backlog if we don't bring in other sources of capital to accelerate the pace and scale of this restoration work, but also to help fund that work. And that's why I said in my intro, and I'm sure folks couldn't hear too much of it, it's not just about reducing the risk of catastrophic wildfire. It's really about protecting water resources, making sure that we have clean air, making sure that we have jobs for folks in these rural areas where unemployment was high before COVID and remains extremely elevated right now in the US. So what we've done in partnership with the federal government and a number of academic partners and the World Resources Institute is say, let's start to work with the other stakeholders who benefit. Water utilities, electric utilities, other state agencies, flood control districts, corporates that bottle water, beer companies, beverage companies, right? And say, what would a healthy forest mean to you? What are those ecosystem service benefits? And then our partners at the World Resources Institute can actually put a dollar value to that. And that's incredibly important because no one's going to just put money up because it feels good. They want to make smart investment decisions. And the resource economics behind this is a critical part of doing that, bringing that cash flow to the financing, and then ultimately being able to sell that stream of cash flows to investors.
Well, if we could stay with aggregating new or unusual payers for a minute and move over to Eric, another project of Quantified Ventures that I've been watching closely over the years is the Reharvest Initiative in Iowa in partnership with the Iowa Soybean Association. and candidly, only have to move it a couple hundred miles north to get traction in Canada, because I think really the same outcomes would be valued in the two provinces directly north of there. So if you could just describe that in a little more detail and speak to scale, because while you talked about the brave days, weeks, months, years of piloting these things, this is a rapidly growing pilot, meaning we probably shouldn't even use the word pilot anymore. So if you could talk to scale a little bit too.
Sure, happy to. And by the way, this story is a good example of the journey, because we started off with the assumption that by paying farmers to build these 5 conservation practices, we would be able to monetize the water quality outcome alone, and that would pencil. A year later, and a lot of money in, that turned out not to be the case. And let's just call that a bad day. We had a pretty bad day. And then it wasn't until we got back to work on it after that bad day, we started to ask ourselves, what are the other benefits that those 5 things that we're asking farmers to build, what else do they create? And the obvious answer was 3 of those 5 practices sequester carbon. Okay, we were back to work. And once we got to work on penciling what we could sell that carbon for, we were able to sell that carbon at just enough unit economics to actually reduce the price of the water quality outcome to the point where it was delicious to our government buyers. So what we had is the same activity yielding 2 outcomes that could subsidize one another to be delicious to 2 outcome buyers. Not how we set out to get that done, but what we ended up finding our way towards. And then to Peter's point, so that is, we actually spun out the company to handle that inflow of debt. So we now borrow, I'll use a technical term, scadzooks of money at the beginning of the growing season, pay farmers, and then we have multi-year offtake agreements with the carbon buyers, the Cargills and the Pepsis and the McDonald's of the world, to purchase the carbon 10 months later. And then we have offtake agreements with players at 3 levels of government to purchase the water quality benefit. And then, Peter, to answer your question about scale, in the off season, we just add another 1 million acres every year. And we are always adding new carbon buyers and new water quality buyers. And then at the end of that period of the season, we know have that many offtake agreements for that many units of water quality benefit and that many units of carbon benefit. We then add that many millions of acres via farmers, and it scales. So we now have expanded to multiple states, and would be thrilled to be talking about going north to Canada.
Great, perfect. We've talked about carbon a bit. We could probably talk about carbon a lot more, but there's an awful lot of conversation all around the globe around carbon. And as Zach talked about, the water quality, air quality benefits of reduced forest fire activities in the West, some of the other things, sort of byproducts or co-benefits associated with both carbon sequestration and permanent conservation, have to do with stuff that happens in and near people, like floods. And so I know, David, you have some thoughts and experiences around flood mitigation activities. If you could share a little bit of that, because I think the human benefits, human dimensions of nature-based climate solutions is what's going to drive even more capital into this space.
Yeah, well, I mean, I haven't really done direct flood mitigation projects, but certainly, one of the critical things to us has been looking at whole of landscapes. And when you think about landscapes, they're providing biodiversity, they're providing carbon stocks, they're also providing water yield and regulation of water quality. And so what we've tried to do in some of our investments where we may have, 90,000 hectares of, say, timber plantations and another 90,000 hectares of natural forest is trying to create a balance there where we look at the outcomes in terms of water yield and water regulation and carbon stock change over time. And in Tasmania, I think we're the largest private landowner in that state. And what we've started to do is holistic natural capital accounting across all of our assets. And that starts to allow us to say, well, our balance sheet now is not just, how many, dollars of timber value we have, but how many tons of carbon stock and what is our carbon stock change and what is our water yield and what is our habitat supply. And then ultimately, I guess is to value those things and find ways that, they can be recognized as commercial assets, not just byproducts that you do through regulatory requirements or out of the goodness of your heart. Ultimately, what you want is for these ecological services to be so valuable that you would never think of impacting on them. And so I guess that's the direction that we're going in is trying to think holistically of how we value and price these things.
I just have one last question for the panel or one of the panelists, and then we'll go to Q&A from the attendees. But Zach, because of your previous career and where we are historically with interest rates, what do you think about the leverage potential in this interest rate environment? Karen already talked about bonds as one of the investable products, so to speak, that can bring capital to natural climate solutions, but I thought you'd share your perspective for a second.
Yeah, thank you for that, Peter. And I'm sure this got missed in my jumbled introduction, but my background actually is in financial engineering. I worked on Wall Street in structured finance and as a bond trader for about a decade before starting Blue Forest. And one of the things that we've been stressing with our investors, some of whom are insurance companies, is that given the interest rate environment around the world, especially here in the United States, it's never going to be cheaper to take on some of these large landscape restoration projects, which are really the only way to reduce the risk of things like catastrophic wildfire in California across the Western US and into Western Canada, obviously. And I think in a lot of ways, these outcomes-based financings that Eric talked about really lend themselves well to a fixed income structure because they create these relatively predictable annual cash flows from all of these projects. So that's something we're going to look to do as we scale up. We want to try to get as much money out in the ground as fast as possible, but we also want to raise that money now because the time is right to do so. And this work's not going to get cheaper as time goes on. So thanks for that question, Peter.
Well, if it's okay with all of you, I have no idea what Jane is going to provide from the audience as far as Q&As, but we'll go to that for about 15 minutes and then we'll be done.
Excellent, Peter. You have a very engaged audience and they're asking all kinds of questions. So let's get started. Question number one.
For me personally, I just want the really simple ones. Okay.
Okay, I'll see if I can filter those out. How's that? You get to direct them, so it's on your side. Question number one. Clearly, most of these models are tied to outcomes. Can any of the panelists speak to challenges in developing agreed upon metrics to demonstrate outcomes or measure of success?
So I'm first going to pick on Eric because I know he had to do this in what in the U.S. was the very first environmental impact bond that was done with the D.C. Water Authority. But you may have another example besides that one. And somehow you are quiet.
Thank you. It's the first time I've ever been called quiet. Here's how we generally think about financing around outcomes. Oftentimes, you've got to keep your eye on transaction costs. And if you get too carried away with really complicated, expensive evaluation mechanisms, which measuring outcomes will tempt you. It will tempt you. Because you're going for perfect and you can see it right off in the distance and you want to keep going. There's a lot of expense down there that a lot of transactions just can't support. But we do these things called outcome logic chains, where if that's the outcome, the transaction that Peter was talking about was one where we financed a whole bunch of green infrastructure in Washington, D.C. to deal with their combined sewer outflow challenges along the Potomac River. And the outcome they wanted was a cleaner Potomac River. And we could have measured around a metric that was attempted to control for all the other pollutants in the Potomac River. That would be very expensive and gets kind of iffy. But if you work backwards from if-then metrics, like if you hit this metric, then this will happen. If you hit this metric, then this will happen. All the way to you get to that final outcome metric, a cleaner Potomac River that you want. We look for what we call proxy metrics, meaning if you can get to this metric along that value chain or that outcome logic chain, and this metric you can get in a science that has a name. So for that particular one, we had a flow in the metric, sewer metric, which starts to fall into a body of science called hydraulic modeling, which is just water through a pipe. And once you're into water in a pipe, you're into familiar territory, meaning you can start to do Monte Carlo simulations and start to predict performance of that metric. What do you end up with? You end up with a 14-page statistical report that's predicting outcome that you can give to your investor to check your math, as opposed to an extraordinarily complicated evaluation model that's going to somehow measure the cleanliness of the Potomac River 10 years later and control for the 4,000 other variables. All to say, simplicity is the answer when it comes to selecting the metric for outcomes-based financing. And don't be afraid of finding proxy metrics that reasonable people agree that if you hit that metric, you're probably going to hit that outcome metric.
Great. Jane?
One thing quickly, if you don't mind. Just on this, one thing to think about too, it's not just the measurement, which is a great point, and our science team really loves extremely complicated things, but it's also the authorities of the different levels of government that you're working with. For example, for us, the Forest Service can't pay for outcomes, so we focus on outputs with them, whereas other stakeholders may be able to make those outcomes-based payments. So I wanted to add to Eric's point, I love that about simplifying and making it cheaper, but also understanding your stakeholders and the authorities they have, and not always going into a policy solution or trying to change things with legislation. Work within those authorities, and that can be a really helpful way to move forward as well.
Great.
Excellent. Question number 2. How is stacking of multiple ecosystem benefits viewed by the buyers and the regulators in these types of setups?
I am going to pick on Eric again because the reharvest example, I think, is a sort of a telling proxy for how stacking can correctly, authentically occur without double counting.
And I got a short answer here. They don't know about each other. One of the interesting parts about outcomes-based financing, especially when you start to stack the outcomes, they don't need to know about each other. All our carbon buyers know is they're purchasing carbon from their supply chain. All our farmers know is we are paying them to profitably do something that they are able to and choose to do. All our water quality outcome buyers know is that here's a unit of reduced phosphorus and nitrate that's not coming to your city. And so all to say, we don't try to spend a lot of time trying to get everybody around a conference room table and be friends. We try to keep it focused on what they actually care about.
Great. I don't know if Karen or David want to offer anything.
Yeah, I might just jump in. This is, I guess as I've been listening to it, I was kind of thinking, if we really want to scale this up to global capital market size, one of the things that we really have to start doing pretty quickly is talking in the language of investors. Investors do not speak the same language of scientists. And I think this is one of the things that makes, that we really have to get to a place where this can be explained in a very simple way. And I sort of thought there are three key ingredients in my mind that are going to attract large scale investing here. The first is being very clear on a business driver with goals and timelines that create a sense of urgency. Well, we have that. We have that through the Paris Agreement, and we have more and more countries and companies aspiring to be net zero by 2050, which actually means undertaking most of their actions by 2030. So that's only 9 years away. So we have the urgency. We also need a clear role of the understanding that nature-based solutions can play. And we already know from scenario analysis that 37% of carbon removal by 2030 can come from nature-based solutions. And the last thing we need to know, which is what you have been talking about right now, are some very simple indicators and principles for determining what constitutes a nature-based solution. And this feels to me the area where we're kind of getting bogged down from large-scale investment right now. But it is, in my view, the biggest challenge. It was overcome when we created things like green bond principles, which did not try to be perfect. They tried to go in the right direction and be accepted universally. And we saw the success of that, going from a market of 0 in 2010 to 200 billion in 10 years. So for all the scientists on the phone and for those who are trying to be links between, I really would just want to say, we really need to elevate our discussion on what we will consider to be the principles and criteria for nature-based solutions. If we want to tap into a market that's already $4 trillion in size, that is the size of the current green market. The size of the current voluntary carbon market is 100 million. So there's a long way to go, and getting the metrics universal is absolutely critical.
Jane, next question.
Ready for the next? Excellent. Here we go. How does one integrate the high risk to natural ecosystems under increased disturbance during climate change? The example being fires in California, hurricanes, etc. How does the market integrate this high risk?
Zach, maybe you can take that on a little bit.
Yeah, it's a question of who's the market in that case, right? When you think about insurance companies that we work with, a lot of that market is around reinsurance, and can you get that reinsurance? And unfortunately, in a state like California, the fire season from 2017 wiped out all the insurance profits from the 20 years prior. 2018 was worse than 2017, and 2020 was significantly worse than 2018. So you can sort of see what is not an anomaly, but unfortunately a trend. And that was one of the reasons why we had to create a new financial instrument, the Forest Resilience Bond, because things like catastrophe bonds related to fire, the risk was just too high, and it really couldn't get priced in this marketplace to shift some of that risk. So we looked for other risks that we could shift, the risk for ecosystem services and outcomes, having utilities make long-term commitments based on those ecosystem services and shifting that risk to investors, because that was a risk that was comfortable for investors to take, and it was efficient because utilities are naturally very risk averse from that standpoint. But we also need to do things, Peter, with respect to the structure of these investments. We use something called a delayed draw term loan to bring money out from our investors, and that way we're not sitting on all their money in case a fire does burn down the project, right? So there are both things you can do on the ground and also from a financial structuring standpoint that can really reduce those risks and make it comfortable at a place where investors can get comfortable with those risks and we can get more work done on the ground.
So, Jane, we probably have time for somewhere between, well, probably about 2 more questions.
Let's give it a try. Next question. At this point, all of the examples of valuing natural assets has been to monetize them. But many of the natural assets are notoriously difficult to monetize. Has there been any work on valuing in ways other than monetizing? And this would speak to Minister Wilkinson's point about separating restoration from conservation of intake ecosystems.
It's a great question. And I also think this is a chance where we have some listening and learning to do from Indigenous groups. Notwithstanding, I said I made the transition over to the dark side about 30 years ago from the NGO world. I still believe that not all of nature needs to be monetized, that there are inherent values that speak to traditional uses of land that have happened for millennia by Indigenous people. So it's a challenge to think in ways that don't have a capital approach to them, but it's certainly necessary. And I think some of the land tenure, land rights models that are being perfected both in Canada and other parts of the world. I'm thinking of what's going on in New Zealand. I'm thinking of the 10 Deserts Initiative in Australia, where the truly authentic collaboration is occurring with First Nations and Indigenous peoples as a way of dealing in a manner where capitalism just doesn't work and shouldn't work.
I think we've got time for one more, Peter, but it'll be tight. Here we go. Do any of you have any examples to share of government incentives that have enabled investment in nature, such as, I just missed that, offering tax breaks or acting as common shareholders for an innovative or risky investment offering?
Well, I'll start and then we can maybe quickly go through the panel. In the states, in the U.S., every state has a infrastructure fund. Actually, I have two of them called Safe Drinking Water and Clean Water State Revolving Funds. And my firm, Lime Timber, in partnership with the Conservation Fund, national NGO in the U.S., and State of Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, approach the SRF in Pennsylvania to provide 20-year concessionary debt to make a transaction work. And why in the world did Lime Timber deserve to get 20-year concessionary debt? Because the land we were buying was the critical upland forest watersheds for about 24 rural communities where the cost of filtration could not be borne by the tax base of those communities. So keeping the forests intact was the rationale for accessing in this case, state-level concessionary financing. But others may have some other examples.
Yeah, Peter, there's been a few examples in Australia where the government has, in a sense, been a buyer of ecosystem services. In the state of Victoria, there's a program called Bush Tender, where the government has said that they will basically buy biodiversity restoration from rural landowners, and you tender into this saying, I would like to revegetate 50 hectares of riparian zone, and my cost per hectare to do this will be $560, and the technical experts will then look at all the different proposals and basically do a reverse auction and buy the ones that are most efficient. And what's happening now is there's a pilot where the government has been buying climate mitigation benefits, and what you find then is, with a price of carbon, like in New Zealand, you'll just plant pine monocultures because it's the most efficient absorption of carbon dioxide. But then they have a second tender in Australia where you can tender in the biodiversity benefits, so you can get kind of a carbon payment. But then if you put diversified species and habitat restoration, you get a second payment for the biodiversity component. And so the government is able to sort of guide the investment of capital into areas that are generating both the conservation and the climate benefit.
Well, unfortunately, this panel, since I know everyone, we could have gone on for weeks and it would have been fun, but we can't. So we've run out of time. First, I want to thank the panelists for joining, and then I want to thank Nature Conservancy of Canada for inviting us to participate in today's conference. So thank you, and I think we're up to a break.
We are indeed. Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you to all the panelists. Great discussion, and we have more questions than we can get to. Hello, and welcome back to Making Nature Investable. Thanks for coming back for our second session. We would now like to reintroduce our President and CEO, Catherine Grenier. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jane. Welcome back, everyone. Like us, I hope you're encouraged by the conversation earlier, or perhaps curious to find more about what we discussed in the first half. We've seen that with shared goals, there's certainly tons of possibilities. Now I'm looking forward to the next session as we dig deeper into the opportunities and the imperative for investing in nature. To introduce our guests and lead the discussion, it's my real pleasure to introduce Mike Pedersen, a strong ambassador for nature conservation. Mike is vice chair of the board of directors at the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and he's also the chair of the board of the Business Development Bank of Canada. So take it away, Mike.
Thank you, Catherine, and hello, everybody. I'm told there's now over 1,200 parties around the world listening to us, so welcome to you all. So it is my honor, as Catherine said, to introduce our next guest, Mark Carney, and then I get to ask him a few questions. So we're very lucky that Mark has volunteered his time to be with us today. Given the topic of this summit, making nature investable, it is really hard to think of a more relevant or more expert authority than Mark. He currently has two roles. The first is United Nations Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance, and the second is Vice Chair at Brookfield Asset Management, where his focus is on investment products that combine positive environmental and social outcomes with strong risk-adjusted returns. As most of you know, Mark was governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013, and he then held the same role at the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020. He was also chair of the Financial Stability Board from 2011 to 2018, quite a period. And prior to his central bank career, he held senior roles at Goldman Sachs and at the Department of Finance in Ottawa. Mark has a long-standing interest in sustainability, and he serves as a board director of several respected policy-oriented and not-for-profit organizations. He recently released a book called Values, which is Mark's prescription for how to create a prosperous, sustainable, and fair world for future generations. And I tell you to read it. You'll be glad you did. Finally, since we're in Canada and since our topic is nature, I'll also just mention that Mark was born in Fort Smith in the Northwest Territories, just below Great Slave Lake, and also in Alberta. So Mark, a huge warm welcome from the 1,200 plus of us who are here. And with that, unless you'd like to rebut anything I've said, we'll turn to the first question.
No, I'll let the record that stand as the record, Mike. And it's a great pleasure to be here. And let me commend you and your colleagues at the Nature Conservancy of Canada for all the great work you're doing. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you for that. All right. So I think we are seeing increasing resolve around the world to address climate change and biodiversity loss. But the challenge we face is big. In your book, you characterize the changes required as staggering. And you point out that to reach the Paris Accord climate goals, we need to cut global emissions in half every 10 years for the next 3 decades. On a broad basis, what will need to change for the world to achieve this, Mark?
Yeah, well, it's right, Mike. It's these are enormous changes. It's every region, every country, every sector, virtually every business will have to adjust. In some cases, fundamentally adjust their business models and strategies. And the scale of investment is required in order to do this is absolutely enormous. And I would divide very simply that scale of investment into 3 areas. One is those technologies that exist today that are economic or economic prospectively with something like, let's call it $100 a ton carbon price or regulation that's consistent with that. We can unpack that, but just give me that assumption. And that can get us about 60% of emission reduction, that order of magnitude of man-made emissions, anthropogenic emissions. Then there's the balance of those emissions that addressed in two ways. One is with emergent technology that is somewhere along the continuum of growth equity, venture capital, and early stage R&D, which is really either philanthropic or public sector investment, and that runs the gamut from hydrogen through to sustainable aviation fuels, direct air carbon capture, all of which have roadmaps to becoming economic, but aren't necessarily there today, and certainly not there yet at scale, and need to be scaled up rapidly. And then the third solution is nature, and nature. I'm saying that in a narrower sense than you look at it, and you look at it in the right sense, but I'm saying it in a narrower sense in terms of achieving the Paris climate goals. And that's not obviously necessary, and much broader issues or initiatives that are necessary to achieve, to rebuild our natural capital and move towards our objectives around biodiversity and other aspects of nature. But so it's possible. The scale's big, and maybe I should just I'll put a figure and I'll stop there. In that first area, that 60% of investment or 60% of emissions that can be reduced, it's really doubling the scale of energy infrastructure investment from around $1.7 trillion a year to about $3.5 trillion a year for each year for the next 3 decades. And just to give orders of magnitude, so you're well over $100 trillion of investment. You can look at that two ways. It's a big job or it's an enormous opportunity. And both are right.
Minister Wilkinson spoke this morning about the fact that governance clearly can't do this alone. When you speak about those kinds of numbers, that really puts it into perspective. Can you talk to us a little bit about the role that the private sector would need to play, or would ideally play, to help achieve those goals and to make those kinds of size investments?
Yeah, and as I think the minister does recognize, and others would recognize, we need all three aspects. We just spoke, at a high level about, let's call it engineering technology. So what's the art of the possible with existing renewables? What needs to happen with technologies like hydrogen and others? What needs to happen with nature? But then we need two other elements here. We need the political, which I'm using a small p in front of political in the sense of its consumer preferences, its social expectations, as well as policies, regulation, actual and perspective. And that's a very important point. So it's not just what are emission standards today or carbon price today, is what are they expected to be tomorrow, and how credible are those expectations? Because the third leg of this, to answer your question in terms of what business can do, and I'm going to speak specifically about what finance can do, is what finance can do, and you know this well, Mike, from your career, is finance will pull forward adjustment. Finance will get ahead of the curve if it has visibility, and we'll come more to that. And so what we're looking to do for COP26 in Glasgow on the private finance side, again, away from government, but on the private finance side, is to have in place the information, the tools, and the markets that are needed for the private sector, private financial sector, to take climate change into account in virtually every financial decision, so that the impact on the climate is one of the determinants of the value of that transaction. And that's a wholesale change. We spoke a moment ago about the staggering scale of what needs to be done. Well, in order to achieve something that is staggering at the outset, you do need a wholesale change, and that means bringing climate into the center of financial decision making. The good news is we're making tremendous progress on that. I'll give you one figure. I gave you a big figure a moment ago. I'll give you another big figure. 2 weeks or so ago at President Biden's climate summit, we announced what we're calling the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is a series of financial institutions from pension funds to insurers to banks around the world, $70 trillion of balance sheet committed to net zero, not just in 2050, but granular, detailed sectoral plans that they'll release over the course of the next 18 months and 3 years that put them on the path to that, including the fair share of reductions. You mentioned the 10%, the halving of emissions and the consistent fall, their fair share of that between now and 2030. So it's moving, but more needs to be done, clearly.
Yeah, so just on that point, if we stay with the financial services sector, and you're involved in several initiatives to try to, change the trajectory at which their support of this objective is rising. But clearly, the trajectory is not steep enough at this point and needs a major readjustment in order to support the kind of change and the size of investments that you're talking about in the next 10 years. I'm not expecting you can preview what COP26 is going to come out with, but in your wish list, are there things that you'd like to see governments consider in terms of public policy or incentives or tax changes to help with all of that?
Well, and I think we should be talking openly about what we all want to see at COP26 and then pushing in order to get it, because if governments show up expecting to find the answer in Glasgow, we're all going to be disappointed. So, in terms of let me say two major pillars of this. The first is to be clear about the role of public policy here. It is absolutely essential, and it's not just policy today, but it's credible policy tomorrow. So those of us who live in Canada and who are on this webinar from Canada would be aware that one example of that is the carbon price in Canada. The minister, I'm sure, spoke about it this morning, but legislating a carbon price that's not just $30 per ton today, but it will be $170 in 2030. And that trajectory is known. It's known to businesses. It's known to Canadians. People start to adjust for that. You get paid, obviously, if you are saving carbon along that timeline and that trajectory. I'll use an example from the UK, where the moratorium on new internal combustion vehicles from 2030. That's a date certain. You can't sell those vehicles. Same thing in Germany, other European countries, a number of other European countries. That type of certainty drives investment today. So we need a package of policies that are consistent with that, supported. And you mentioned this, Mike. It is important tax policy, a tax policy that accelerates investment. And so it's not just the production, if you will, but the investment tax credit. And the carbon price gives you the production tax credit for those who are still following me. We're tax junkies, but you need the investment tax credits as well. And those need to be generous. We've seen some progress. My personal view is we need to see more on that. Now, what about finance, and what do we want government to do for finance? Well, we need some basics. We need information. You can't make decisions without information. And the private sector on climate, and I'll underscore on climate, not necessarily nature, but on climate, has made a lot of progress with something called the TCFD, which is climate-related financial disclosure. It's the gold standard. It's time to make it mandatory for all companies. And there are pathways. What we want for Glasgow is governments to sign up to make it mandatory. UK has already moved. They're legislating it for all companies. Japan has moved. It's through their securities regulation. It's going to be comply or explain, which effectively means if you're a public company in Japan, you will do it. And they are the leaders in this disclosure already globally. Europe is legislating through the CSRD, was the acronym that's relevant. It's more than climate, but it's there. And very importantly, we've encouraged, and this I think will happen, is that the body that regulates disclosure in 140 countries, something called the IFRS, which only focuses on financial disclosure, so think accountants, financial disclosures, is setting up a whole new pillar. This would be confirmed by Glasgow for sustainability disclosure. So all aspects of sustainability, what do you disclose for that? And they're starting with climate on the TCFD, and the question is, how do they build out from there? So that's part of what we want from government. We want clear policy. We want some of this plumbing in the financial sector to be put in place. I could give you a much longer list, but we have we have 30 minutes left, and we have a range of things to talk about. So I'll hand back to you.
That's very helpful, and kudos to you for the leadership role you've played in TCFD. If we just move from financial sector to all private sector companies, many of them think of this climate as a risk management issue. Some think of it as strategic opportunity. Some think of it as both. How should they be thinking about it? How would you think about it? How are you thinking about it in your corporate role?
Well, I think about it, and so you asked from a corporate perspective. I think with any determinant of value, and you know this from your career in finance, you have to look at both sides. You have to look at the opportunity and the risk. And so there are assets for which the transition to net zero success is failure for them. Because they're not ready. They're not part of the solution towards net zero. Their technology is not consistent, and their opportunity set is not consistent with that. And they are businesses or assets that will be run down. And think of coal, think of thermal coal. I mean, the calculations are something on the order of 75% of known reserves of thermal coal have to stay in the ground if we're going to have a chance of meeting our staying within our current carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. Lots of other things have to happen as well, but that's a necessary condition. And there are analogies of that throughout the sector. So that's the downside, that's the risk. And I think every financial investor now that climate is mainstreaming, now that the world is getting very serious about it, I'm not saying we're going to succeed, obviously I want us to, but now the world's serious about it, every financial investor and business needs to look at, well, what if we are successful? What if policies are consistent with getting to 1.5 degrees? What if these other technologies come in? What will I wish I had done? What at that point, 10 years out, 20 years out, what does it do to my existing business? What investments do I need to make today? That's the risk side. The flip side is the opportunity side. It's partly the big numbers I referenced at the start in terms of the scale of investment that's needed, but it's also goes to a very fundamental point, and I think this is what stretches as well to our broader topic of nature, which is, what does society value? Society is saying very clearly in consumption patterns and voting patterns and in protest movements and social movements broadly, deal with this issue. We've got 130 plus countries who have net zero as an objective. The world wants us to deal with it, and companies that are part of the solution are going to create tremendous value in that process. And so one of the things that we're doing at Brookfield is we are going out, we're raising a lot of money, we're putting a lot of our money behind it, billions and billions of dollars, to help companies decarbonize. We're going to where the emissions are, helping them invest to decarbonize so that they are part of the solution. And that will create, in our judgment, tremendous value. And the good news is that that type of strategy is being replicated across the financial sector, which is what we need for the scale of investment that's required to achieve what, as I said a moment ago, what society wants.
That's great, Mark. I services industry globally that said that the cost of not reacting to the risks is 1/3 of the upside of capturing the strategic opportunities for the sector. So, it just goes to your point. Both are important, but the strategic upside seems to be what should be really driving people and will really make us transform. If you don't mind, moving to the conference, the topic is about nature-based solutions to address the so-called twin crises of biodiversity and climate change. And broadly, we define nature-based solutions as nature conservation that has climate or biodiversity benefits, but also addresses other societal challenges. And some proven examples are, and we've heard about them today, using forests as carbon sinks, or conserving land to preserve species, or using green infrastructure to prevent natural disasters and flooding and so on. So our hope at NCC is that we can encourage the creation of more innovative nature-based solutions, partly through conferences like this, and that we can incent the private and public sector to invest significant capital in them. Can we hear your thoughts about how to make that happen on a large scale, not just in Canada, but around the world?
Yeah, well, let me start maybe with a bit of a framing of how the system, how we can value nature in the system. because obviously we've been doing a terrible job of properly valuing it, which is why, and you look at a number of studies, but I'll just point to the Desgupta review of biodiversity done for the UK government a few months ago, which I'd recommend. I'm sure a number of people on this webinar have seen it, and many might have contributed to it. But he cites the 40% drawdown in natural capital since the early 1990s globally, and that's order of magnitude right, I'm sure, and applies to all of us. And so first is recognizing the issue, and how do you build back up. And I'll point to a couple of things that the way the system is beginning to address this issue, and the question is what we can do to reinforce it. The first is with the rise of ESG and a greater focus on social licenses is really screening out bad actors or people, companies that are not taking into account their impact on the environment and are in the more egregious end of the spectrum. So that's something. The second is around disclosure, and I think we'll come back to that. So the TCFD, which is around climate, it points in the direction and gives a sense, and there tends to be some correlation, some positive correlation between those who perform well on TCFD metrics and also would in line with nature-based solutions, but it's not perfect. There's the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. Maybe we'll have a chance to pull that out in a bit more detail, which I think is critical to this. The third thing, though, that is developing, which I think is quite attractive, is work that we're doing for COP on a market for carbon offsets, voluntary carbon offsets. And to be clear, this market, first and foremost, is about addressing climate change and activities that remove carbon from the atmosphere. So think reforestation on nature-based. I know this is a sophisticated audience, you understand that, but also avoid emissions. So preserve rainforest or preserve mangrove swamps or activity. And obviously in the preservation area, you have to be very focused on additionality and the integrity of those credits. Look, for all the noise around these areas, these are relatively modest-sized markets. They're measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Our judgment is that this needs to be a $70 to $100 billion a year market in order for us to stay within our carbon budget. There's other benefits, obviously, for nature, but just from within the carbon budget. And so we need a fully professionalized market. The good news is there's a tremendous amount of work going on that we've catalyzed out of the private sector. It's led by a fellow named Bill Winters, who runs Standard Chartered, led by Nat Nazareth, the former commissioner at the SEC. 180 different institutions, including a large number of NGOs that are involved in this, to develop this market. It's on track. This work is on track. The blueprint is out. The working groups are due to report in the summer. They're going to meet that deadline, is my understanding. And we can be in a position to launch this market. Now, what, you say, so what does this actually mean from a nature perspective? And this is, I think, the first opportunity where we have an opportunity to have a scaled market in nature-based solutions, principally, but not exclusively, for climate. And let me explain that, which is that this is a market that properly constituted will be both on exchange. So there's a publicly, liquid traded contract for both reduction and avoidance. So one for each, because they're not exactly analogous. But then there are a series of investments or contracts traded in what's called the over-the-counter market that reference those underlying core carbon contracts. That's what they're called. Now, those over-the-counter instruments, the core value element of it is how much carbon are you reducing, right? So you reforest, how much carbon are you reducing? But if you appreciate this far better than I. There's a difference between monoculture reforestation and true biodiversity in reforestation. And the value that a buyer, and to be clear, the buyer of these contracts are corporates who are looking to achieve their net, or largely corporates, their net zero targets. they will pay for that. You can expect them to pay for that. So there are some what's called co-benefits to the contracts, and that's the first time where you get a liquid market in some of these biodiversity benefits above and beyond the carbon benefit of that. Our perspective on it is that this is an advanced economy buyer market. So companies that have made net zero commitments, largely in the advanced economies, and most, but not all, of the supply of this will come from emerging and developing economies. Some can come from Canada, of course, as well. And this is this aligns incentives across the system, and is potentially a very critical part of the overall development. Now, just final point on it: it's complementary. It's complementary to the overall development. And when I say development, I mean addressing climate change. But it's the first scaled opportunity to price biodiversity, albeit imperfectly, and start to grow out these nature-based solution opportunities.
That's fantastic. It will be a great thing if we can do that. We're cheering you on, and it can hopefully serve as a model for other markets in addition to carbon. You mentioned the Dasgupta report, and the World Economic Forum has said that half of the world's GDP is either highly or moderately dependent on nature. Yet, and you alluded to this, nature is in sharp decline, over 1 million species facing extinction, and all kinds of other risks. And that's led to several countries and some NGOs creating TNFD, or the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which is quite analogous to TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which you've spearheaded. And the goal of TNFD is to provide corporates in all sectors with best practice advice for measuring the financial risks that they face as a result of things like overexploitation of resources or deforestation, poor soil management, and so on, or as a result of extreme weather events. So TNFD is already, although it's fairly nascent, being supported by a number of global financial institutions and other organizations. Can you comment on how the two might ultimately fit together, TNFD and TCFD, biodiversity and climate?
Well, the first thing, it is a very welcome development. It's a more complicated area than climate. I mean, climate's tough enough, but it's in the end, one's mapping into GHG space or carbon, tons of carbon equivalent space, and the impact on the company's contribution, and then the impact of policies that are focused in on that massive but narrowly defined set of issues for climate, and what's the impact in terms of transition risk for the company, and how is it going to address it? I would say one point, and I'll come back to this very importantly, for the TCFD, Task Force Climate Related Financial Disclosure, which is for those who are not always following the acronyms, that's the bit that I was saying a few minutes ago that we want to make mandatory as part of the COP process for obvious reasons. That focuses in on the financial impact on the company, so of climate. So it's the impact of physical effects of climate, but it's also the impact over time of, for example, the change in policy. So the rising carbon price I described earlier, what does that do to the company's strategy and the disclosure around that? So it's a forward-looking aspect. It doesn't include the impact of the company on the climate per se, okay, which is an important distinction. So it doesn't have that double materiality, is the term for that. The TNFD, more complicated because it's nature, which in itself, I mean, that's part of the challenge is, of course, the complexity and the feedback loops one has for nature. So it's exactly as you described, Mike, the impact of, for example, and I'll speak like an economist, but diminishing ecosystem services on the company. So an easy example, or at least one that's feels tangible, is I run an agribusiness, and the reduction in pollinators, a reduction in bees, and the impact on my agribusiness ultimately over time, or that sort of direct challenge, but also is likely to include my impact on nature. So that double materiality aspect, which is a critical element to it. So it's the disclosure in terms of my footprint on nature, and that's critical in terms of both information for all stakeholders, including, to narrow it to the financial side. Let's say I purely have a financial relationship with the company, or I think I do. That's interesting for me. That's important for me. It's not like just passing interest, because it tells me about, obviously by definition, the company's impact on nature, but it tells me something about the prospective impact on that company's social license, right? Something that is not necessarily material today, perhaps because people didn't know about it or understand the scale of the impact, or that society's, people's views on the importance of certain species loss or the impact on a biosphere or something becomes more and more prevalent, or government regulation shifts or prospectively shifts. All of a sudden, that which wasn't directly material to the company's operations becomes very material. You can't hire the employees, you have fines, you have all these aspects. And by getting that information out in the public domain, we present obviously a truer picture of the company's impact. We underscore a basic point that the Nature Conservancy has always understood. The Dasgupta report emphasizes the world forgets sometimes, which is we are all a part of nature. We're part of the ecosystem, not separate from it, a part of it, and drawing from ecosystem services. We're part of it. And that changes the lens and the perspective on corporate activity and therefore the perception of value that comes from that. Of course, these perceptions go both ways, because if you're adding to nature, if you're reinforcing, if you're helping to preserve, you rightly should capture some of that value. Not, you won't capture all of it, but capture some of that in terms of stakeholder perception, stakeholder support, and valuation indeed in the market.
In many respects, it's wonderful that we're even these conversations. A lot of talk last couple of years about moving to be purpose-led as opposed to just shareholder value guided. And you look around, and there are companies that are changing from a pure focus on shareholder value to considering all of these issues, but it's more of a means to an end. But there are many companies that are now thinking in broader terms, in terms of purpose and value. One of the really instructive things for me that actually gives me optimism is looking at banks around the world, which are, notwithstanding that some of them blow themselves up every decade or so, most of them are very conservative. And the fact that they have signed up for, net zero goals 30 years out for, scope 3, their supply chain, their financing impact and so on, without having a clue what it'll cost them, because they don't know what, for example, offsets will cost 5, 10, 15 years from now. That tells me something has changed. I don't know if you can comment on that dynamic in marketplace and amongst corporates right now.
Yeah, I think it's important. So let's put it again in context. Again, for the Biden summit, there were over 40 banks and 5 continents, including some of the largest banks and the largest banks in the world, signing up for exactly what you described, a net zero commitment for 2050, a pathway through to 2030. So in other words, analogous to what countries are signing up to in terms of their way station, medium-term way station in 2030. And then commitments for specific sector strategies that will come out over the course of the next 3 years for decarbonization and annual reporting of all of this. So that those are huge commitments. I mean, that is the gold standard in terms of these commitments, and banks should be rightly recognized. Now, the intention of the banks is rightly so, is to work with their clients and help those clients invest so that those clients can decarbonize on the pathways that, and I'd underscore this, that their countries have chosen. So this announcement, this agreement came together at the same time that President of the United States set out the U.S. objective of down 50% by 2030. Canada upped its objective, as the minister I'm sure underscored today, from 40 to 45% by 2030. Japan 45 to 50. The UK 68% by 2030. Germany's now up to 65, et cetera, et cetera. So companies are operating in that framework. Society is saying that's where we want you to go. They will be investing in that direction. They absolutely need finance to help them with it, to support them. Finance is an enabler. You know that. You've dedicated your career to it, and that's what it needs to do. And what these banks are saying is, we will have this lens, and we're going to support. Now, part and parcel of that, what comes with it is lending, investing sometimes in industries that emit today a lot of greenhouse gases, but for investments that are going to get those levels of greenhouse gases down over time, and that's we have to go to where the emissions are and support those who have strategies, solutions, investments, and the intention to reduce it. And that's the it's not the quid pro quo. That's the essence of what it means to transition from where we are today to where we need to get to. We're not all the way there, but I would say that I feel a lot better, having 70 trillion of balance sheet from the banks through to the pension funds around the world committed in this direction. I'd like to see more. I think we'd all like to see more by Glasgow. I think we will see more, but we'll also see more strategies and policies out of countries, out of companies, and transactions on the ground that move it forward. The challenge, as if that weren't enough of a challenge, but alongside that is to have nature, broader nature, part and parcel of the conversation and the strategies.
Yeah, and thankfully, the financial services industry are also really strong participants in that debate, including in Canada. Maybe just to sort of step back or elevate the discussion a little bit from some of the subjects we talked about. You've said about climate change that the task is large, the window of opportunity is short, and the risks are existential. What are your biggest concerns writ large? Overall, are you optimistic? Do you think we can solve this problem by 2050?
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember when I said that, which was at a very large event at the European Union, at the Parliament, and it would have been 2.5 years or so ago. And the task felt absolutely enormous, and the conversation was almost exclusively about the risks at that time. And the task is still enormous, but as we've been discussing, the conversation has shifted to the other side of the coin, very much so, in terms of the opportunity. And I like what you were saying, and directionally I agree with it. That sort of 2-to-1 ratio of opportunity to risk. That one, the fellow who mentioned about his managing his downside versus taking the upside. So it's moved a lot, and that that one cannot help but be optimistic because of that momentum. The concern, the pessimism, comes from just the scale of the task. We've left it very late, and that's a constant reminder. And I think we do need to retain the focus in terms of the scale of the challenge and the speed with which we need to move. But if you were to give me a binary choice, yes, I am much more optimistic, because this is mainstreaming. It's absolutely a top 3 issue for leadership of virtually every financial institution, most companies around the world, most governments around the world. And actually, I have, even though we slightly got ourselves in this mess, I've got a lot of faith in the inventiveness of people and the determination when they set their mind to it. And the main thing is that, I have some perspective on what the pathway could be to net zero. The one thing I know is that won't come to pass, because a lot smarter people around the world will come up with new ideas and ways of accomplishing it. And I'll give one last example of it. the extent there are a certain set of assumptions that I can put out there to say that the investment required on the energy transformation is, and lots of experts will come up with these and have somewhere between 100 and 125 trillion dollars between now and the end of 2050. Well, the one thing I'm pretty confident is that if something looks like it's going to cost $100 trillion, it will cost less, because people will figure out, in the private sector ways of saving money, ways of getting there more efficiently and rapidly, given just absolutely the scale of that opportunity set. And fantastic. I look forward to seeing those, those solutions come through.
I'm going to ask you in a second if you have any final thoughts to share with us. But just before we do that, in the answer you just gave, you referred to the fact that things don't always work out the way you expect. And in your book, you spoke about the concept of humility. And I thought it was a great discussion. I wonder if you could just share with us a few of those thoughts before we hear any final thoughts you have.
Well, it's interesting. I close it with humility, and I'm getting more humble as time goes on, Mike. But this is like humility with a reason, and part of it was the nature of being a central banker and to some extent a public official. Your job is to plan for failure in many respects, certainly as a central bank, and so you're not. You get yourself in trouble if you try to convince yourself all the reasons why there won't be a financial crisis, or there won't be a cyber attack, or there won't be a pandemic. You should start by assuming that all of those things happen, or each of those things happen. And then the question you want to ask yourself is, what do I wish we had done beforehand in order to put ourselves in a better position if there is a successful cyber attack? What's the strategy to get things up and running again? What parallel systems do we have in place? Obviously, I think we can all draw up our lists. Unfortunately, we're all experts now on pandemic preventiveness and preparedness, and there's certain things that we should do in advance. Same thing on finance. Obviously, challenge with climate is we don't get a do-over. So what should we be doing today in order to? So that planning for failure is important. That humility that comes with that. I think secondly, you want to combine humility with ambition. So decide where we need to go, what we absolutely want, and we don't have a perfect map out there, but have some faith that the system can build those solutions. And I think we are seeing that with climate already. Even in the last 18 months, the amount of progress that's been made on the ground in terms of technology and innovation is tremendous. I think the third thing that comes with it, though, is just a lesson from a public service perspective, which is, there's a huge. I know from my own personal, experience. I did not set out to become governor of the Bank of England, and there's a huge amount of luck that was involved in that. And it's once you start to believe that your position is, it was yours and you've earned all of it, that you lose the perspective in terms of what your responsibilities that come along with these positions. And in many respects, whether you're running a bank, an NGO, you have policy responsibility. It's a responsibility for, at a minimum, the organization and the other people who work there. But it's also a bit of responsibility for the system, and how do we contribute to the overall system? And to me, that's an element of humility, is recognizing that in many respects, however grand we are, or seem that we're custodians, and we want to leave things better than we found it, and nowhere more so than climate. And I'm sad to say that over my lifetime, climate has gotten considerably worse, and biodiversity loss has been tremendous. And part of the reason why I want to be part of tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people who are trying to turn those trends around.
It strikes me as an excellent theme on which to close. We have maybe 1 minute if there's anything else you want to share.
Well, I think the main thing, Mike, I just share. I do want to finish where I started, which is to compliment you personally and the Nature Conservancy of Canada for the work you're doing. Those who support you and those who are out there acting to not just preserve our heritage but rebuild it. And I guess the last point is that. And it kind of goes back on the humility side, is in the end, what's our legacy? I mean, apart from in this case, part of your legacy you will leave is biodiversity and natural capital. But it's also an example, and it's an example that lives on in others. And one of the lessons of the pandemic and else is that good acts breed good acts, and volunteerism breeds volunteerism, and public spiritedness breeds public spiritedness, and that's what we need. And so more power to you. And I'm really grateful that you included me in today, and just again just underscore my appreciation for everything the NCC is doing.
Well, thank you, Mark. To put it mildly, you are a globally driving force on these issues, and as Canadians, we're proud. Maybe not as proud as the folks in Fort Smith, but we're proud that you're a Canadian and leading this. And you've given us more optimism to come back to a theme you discussed. And finally, just want to again thank you. You're insanely busy, and for you to spend all this time and come to talk to us is deeply, deeply appreciated. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mike. It's a great pleasure.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mike, for a great session. What a pleasure. I think we could have continued that conversation for many, many hours. I think for me, one thing I'm taking away from this is your confident optimism. I think you're very practical in a way that the call to action and the imperative is huge and urgent. But this frame of looking at it as it's either a big job versus an enormous opportunity, I really want to take the call, and that everybody in the room is taking the call, that it's a strategic upside, and we collectively must seize it. And I think that's a really good segue for our next session, because now what do we do, right? No meeting should be ending without looking ahead in an action plan. So we've called our final session appropriately, Next Steps, Action Items to Create Investable, Nature Positive Outcomes. And we posed the question to a really skilled panel in terms to scale up investment in nature-based solutions. What do we have to do to enable our ambitions? So our moderator, Stuart Algie, Chair of Smart Prosperity and Professor of Law at the University of Ottawa, will lead the panel through this great conversation about how do we make it happen. So whenever you're ready, Stuart.
Thank you, Catherine. I don't think I'll ever be ready to follow Mark Carney on a panel, but I'll do my best. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Watching the last session, I really like the idea of starting off with why I work on these issues briefly. So my story is I left a Bay Street corporate lawyer job in 1988 to move to Alaska, work as a lawyer for the Sierra Club, and spent 2 years in court litigating to protect Alaska's wilderness and suing Exxon over the Valdez oil spill. And it really changed my life. I came back to Canada and started what is now the largest environmental law organization in the country, EcoJustice. And we spent a decade in court taking big bad CEOs to court to protect nature. And we won a lot of cases, but at the end of that decade, I came to meet some of these big bad CEOs and realized that they weren't really so evil, that none of them woke up in the morning thinking, gee, I'd love to destroy the planet today. They woke up thinking, I want to make a profit. And if they could do that in a way that actually lowered their environmental footprint, they would have been thrilled. But they worked in a market economy that made that really hard because it didn't value nature. So personally, I quit what I thought was a great job, went back and did a PhD at Yale in my 40s to learn economics. Got hired at University of Ottawa as a professor and started an environment economy think tank called Smart Prosperity, which I now chair and has a great group of staff and a network of over 100 professors around the world. And I said, little plug, I should say, we just put out a big report today on investing in nature, which I think you'll enjoy. So if you look at Smart Prosperity's website. So that's my story briefly. Today's session is about how do we unleash investment to conserve and restore nature, both for economic and environmental reasons. Economically, the World Economic Forum listed its top 5 threats to the global economy last year, and all 5 of them were environment related for the first time ever. Environmentally, you all are well aware of the risks posed by global climate change and biodiversity loss. Canada has made ambitious commitments to tackle both, to protect 30% of our lands and waters by 2030, and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by more than 40% in that time. And hundreds of companies have now made similar pledges. So there's a lot of momentum for action. And to give credit, the government has done more in the last 5 years than we've seen in the previous 20, including a $4 billion commitment in the last budget. But there's a long way to go. Global estimates are we need to generate more than $800 billion in financing to meet our biodiversity targets by 2030, and we're at about 125 now. In Canada, that financing gap is about $15 to $20 billion, so still large. So how do we do that? How do we close that gap and pull in the private capital needed to meet our climate and biodiversity targets? Well, to answer those questions, we've got a great panel. First of all, we've got Mandy Gull, who is the Deputy Grand Chief of, sorry, I'm looking down because my light is over here, of the Cree First Nation, of the Cree Nation in Quebec. Amanda Reed, who is Director of Strategic Partnerships at Nature United. Craig Stewart, Vice President of the Insurance Bureau of Canada. And Rob Wilson, Director of Conservation Finance for Nature Conservancy of Canada, are hosts. So, with that introduction, let me turn it over to our panel of experts to start picking away at this problem. I'm going to start with you, Rob, if I can. Let's break down what we mean by conserving and restoring nature. There's different types of projects across Canada that can conserve nature for different purposes, biodiversity, climate change, floods, fire. Can you talk a bit about these different types of conservation projects and what NCC is doing to help pull finance into them?
Yes. Yeah, thanks, Stuart. It's a great question. And I think it's NCC, I mean, we have a somewhat unique position that we work on the ground from coast to coast to coast. So we see firsthand the effects of climate change and also see the effects on biodiversity loss as well. So we are a strong believer in nature-based solutions is I think, the future of solving some of these problems and are undertaking projects on the ground. So we're in a position to deliver actual outcomes. So it might be helpful just to give some examples. Certainly, we're undertaking projects that in many cases reduce the risk of avoided conversion. So avoided conversion of forest lands, avoided conversion of grasslands, and that results in significant carbon stores that are avoided in terms of emissions, as well as ongoing sequestration of those landscapes for carbon. We also work to improve landscape resiliency through restoration work. That's replanting native vegetation, reforestation, stabilizing stream banks, wetland restoration, pollinator habitat, a variety of activities that are nature-based solutions to help make a more resilient landscape. And then we also provide adaptation opportunities for species to adapt to the effects of climate change through ecological corridors or the ability to elevationally adapt to climate change, et cetera. So maybe a couple of examples, Stuart, of some projects specifically that offer nature-based solutions. We talk a lot about carbon. One of our main projects is the Darkwoods Conservation Area located in southeastern British Columbia near Nelson, which is the largest conservation project on private land in Canada, and it's also one of North America's largest forest carbon projects. So we're able to create very significant biodiversity outcomes in terms of protecting species at risk, connecting protected lands for much wider areas, and also able to avoid carbon emissions through protecting forest lands and using carbon credits to help facilitate our ongoing work on that. So that's one example. We're piloting similar projects in southern Alberta that we hope to expand to Saskatchewan and Manitoba in terms of avoiding conversion of grasslands, which result in carbon being stored in the landscape that can create credits for landowners. So in a way of incenting them to do the right thing. We also are involved in water management programs, wetland restoration programs, for example, in southwestern Ontario, that also retain water on landscapes and create biodiversity outcomes and mitigate against the need for built infrastructure because of the benefits they provide to downstream communities. So avoided flood risk, for example. The Minising Wetlands is a great example in central Ontario. We've been working with partners for about since 1974, and that has a significant impacts on Georgian Bay and Wasaga Beach in terms of mitigating the effects of flood risk annually. And then just at the East Coast, I just mentioned, I think, working to protect coastal areas such as salt marshes that need room to migrate and deposit additional organic debris and serve as one of the first lines of defense against climate change. So a great example, again, of trying to deal with climate change and biodiversity loss through a nature-based solution that avoids having to build more infrastructure and more diking, for example. So just some examples of some of the nature-based solutions broadly that we're using, Stuart, across the country.
Thanks, Robin. We'll dig down into those as we go. Let me shift to Mandy, though. Mandy, Indigenous peoples across Canada have a huge role to play in conserving nature. Can you tell us about your experience and particularly with the Cree Nation territory, what you've done, why you did it, what were some of the key challenges you come across?
Jestem Gandino Yemen, Mshawano Wajamal, and Skumno, Mstira, but we samiak the Jamud Mani was changes. I just wanted to give my opening statement in Cree. My name is Mandy Gall. I'm the Deputy Grand Chief of the Cree Nation of Iwishchi. It's a real pleasure to be here today to share about the story of Iwishchi and our efforts to conserve our traditional territories. For us, we've been working on a lot of environmentally driven files. For the past 20 years, I would say, we really began to react and respond to development that was going to be occurring within Iwishchi territory. Iwishchi is located in northern Quebec, James Bay. We're a nation of 10 communities. We have an extremely large land base, over 300,000 square kilometers. We like to say that it's roughly the size of Iceland, so it's fairly large. And one of the things that we were really forced to respond to about 10 years ago was the Quebec government's call to undertake Plan Nord, which was development of the Northern Territory in Quebec. And for us, in response to that statement from the government, we really issued a call to ensure that we undertook measures for conservation and protection of our traditional territory prior to any kind of development. So some of the work that we undertook was creating a conservation strategy based on the Cree vision of what Plan Nord would be. We had a number of targets that we wanted to reference, looking at things such as watersheds, water sources in the Cree territory, biodiversity, traditional habitats, traditional and cultural practices, wildlife, natural habitats, plants and fauna, food security, involvement of the youth and elders, and ensuring that we outlined areas of conservation. In addition, I'm very pleased that after a number of years, our successful work in identifying these traditional territories set aside for protection were marked by a partnership announcement with Quebec in December of 2020, where we successfully outlined the protection of 20% of our territory to the highest degree of protection. And we continue to work on the targets of protecting 30% in addition by 2030. So I'm really proud of the work that our government has been doing. We have an amazing team. This would not have been possible without strong partnerships from our NGOs and, of course, our staff that have been working on this file for years and years and years. Their commitment, and most importantly, I would have to say this would never have been possible without the knowledge and information that our traditional tallyman carried and identified in our territory.
Thank you, Mandy. I say in the 25 years I've been working on these issues, the Cree have always been inspirational leaders. So thank you for continuing that tradition. Amanda, Nature United is a part of a global organization. Can you tell us a bit about how that global expertise and experience can help inform conservation finance in Canada, unleash nature-based solutions for climate and biodiversity?
Sure, thanks, Stuart, and thanks, Rob, for inviting me today. I would like to recognize that I'm calling in from Ottawa, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin. So one of my favorite examples of conservation finance is the water funds in Latin America that were initiated by my global affiliate, Nature United's global affiliate. And after more than a decade, there's now 32 water funds that are supporting conservation over 7 million acres and benefiting 50 million people with clean and abundant water. One specific water fund is in Rio de Janeiro, where the municipality started collecting fees from downstream water users and making payments directly to upstream farmers and ranchers to keep trees on their lands that would protect the watershed. FEMSA, which is the second largest bottling company for Coca-Cola worldwide, has always been a financial partner in this initiative because their business model is dependent on clean and abundant water. So that's just one of the global examples that's informing our work for Nature United in Canada. In Canada, we have a very strong focus on supporting Indigenous-led economic development and conservation. And that includes supporting Indigenous economic development visions that align with cultural values and creating conservation financing vehicles for long-term stewardship, protection and stewardship of nature. We're also on the verge of launching a new groundbreaking study on natural climate solutions, which are actions to protect, manage, and restore grasslands, wetlands, forests, agricultural lands that avoid greenhouse gas emissions and sequester greenhouse gases. The study also identifies the scale of investment that's going to be needed to achieve that potential in the near term. Today on our panel, there are two things that I definitely want to emphasize. And actually, you can put up my slide at this point. Two things I want to emphasize as we're talking about creating investable projects and accelerating environmental markets. First point is government intervention is critical, and Mark Carney talked a lot about this. It's critical for establishing value of nature, for creating market structures, and for incentivizing changes in the way that we manage nature. My second point I really want to dig into is technology and the importance of technology in measuring value, establishing metrics, and monitoring outcomes, and reducing transaction costs. So to reiterate these points, I did want to share this slide. This is from a global study that was initiated by our global affiliate. It's the financing mechanisms that are needed to reverse global biodiversity decline. As you can see, nature-based solutions, carbon markets, biodiversity offsets, green financial projects, sustainable supply chains, and of course, natural infrastructure are included here. And two of the critical takeaways from this report was that government action is essential for paving the way, and nature must be properly valued across all economies. So I'm looking forward to digging into what this means for Canada, creating investable projects, accelerating markets here at home and abroad. Thanks.
Amanda, and we're going to dig down into those two key points in a second here. But first, let me shift over to Craig Stewart, who has a wonderful last name. Craig, you come at this from a private sector perspective, Canada's insurance companies. What do you think we need to do to draw private investment into natural resilience projects for things like climate adaptation and flood management?
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you to the Nature Conservancy of Canada for hosting this event today. I too am calling in from Western Quebec, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. I'll start off with a simple quandary. Resilience doesn't pay. Even though Canada is warming at twice the global rate of much of the rest of the world, and even though insurers are paying four times as much on average as we did before 2008. And even though extreme weather is costing Canadian governments and taxpayers over $5 billion a year, investors can't make money from projects that protect Canadians. And this is a similar situation in the rest of the world. This is a big problem. It's also a considerable opportunity. So we define climate resilience as the ability for a community to absorb future stress from floods, windstorms, wildfires, while continuing to function. Infrastructure such as stormwater system upgrades, flood diversion channels, or natural features such as wetlands or sand dunes or elsewhere mangroves or coral reefs are key to increasing resilience. Currently, infrastructure projects that build resilience are paid for by taxpayers, either directly or indirectly. For instance, the City of Toronto, Canada, is spending $10 billion over 10 years to upgrade its stormwater management system, building bigger pipes that carry more stormwater. They have designed some city parks, such as Trinity Bellwoods, as holding ponds and are installing cisterns under them. Currently, the city is paying for these upgrades through its budget, but is exploring other options. These options could include user fees, development cost charges, PACE loans, issuance of a green bond, or federal funding through programs such as the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund. But at the end of the day, it's taxpayers, the public, who are footing the bill. Resilience is not investable yet from a private sector perspective. So here's my key takeaway. As an insurance industry, we're motivated to fix this problem. Now, you've heard from Zach Knight from the California perspective earlier, Insurers and reinsurers lose money in parts of this country, just as we do in California. But there are a couple of sideboards to consider. First, I'm going to be focusing on flooding in my comments today, but wildfire is also an issue. And local governments in Canada typically shy away from debt instruments, and this will be even more true post-pandemic. So we need to make not just nature investable, but to make resilience investable through a variety of market alternatives. And that's an opportunity, because if we can fix this for dams, diversion canals, and culverts, we can also fix it for wetlands and sand dunes as well. So presently, the World Economic Forum, the Global Commission on Adaptation, the government of the UK, and Willis Towers Watson are leading the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, or CCRI. Infrastructure Canada has signed on behalf of the Government of Canada, as have governments from Australia and the state of California. The goal is to translate the loss avoidance potential of a stormwater management system, or a wetland, into an investable instrument that yields financial returns, or to securitize the debt instruments used to finance resilience. After all, if we can securitize debt through mortgage-backed or asset-backed securities, we should also be able to do so for natural assets that provide resilience. The CCRI is a COP26 flagship initiative, and we're well placed in Canada to initiate pilot projects this year that price the value of natural assets and innovate financial instruments that apply private capital to building systemic resilience. Thanks. Back to you, Stuart.
Thanks, Chris. So I want to play off that comment you made, and that Amanda kind of agreed that as it stands, nature conservation is not really investable. And I think people will know that a lot of that's because it's a public good. You know, you can't walk into a store and buy an ecosystem service or a ton of carbon sequestration where you can a smartphone or potato chips. And so there's a big role to play for governments in creating the demand and the conditions that will ultimately unleash the private capital that will carry us through our goals. Government has to play a catalytic role if we want to unleash the private side of this investment. So let's explore that a little bit. What are the different things that governments must do if we're going to pull the private sector into this in a way that people say is needed? Amanda, maybe I can start there with you. What can you say about government's role in pulling private capital into conservation finance?
Sure, definitely. Yeah, I think the government has a huge role to play, not only in creating the markets, but also in creating the pipeline of projects. So both on that supply and demand side. For the market, I mean, simple, we need a perceived value and we need someone to pay for that value. And like you said, we're talking about a lot of public goods, air, water, ecosystems, and the government has the regulatory authority to protect these systems. And it can create regulatory frameworks that protect these systems and also account for the cost of externalities from our economic activity. And in creating these frameworks, it then can create the market frameworks for actually investing in nature. So I think a great example where Canada is leading on this, and Mark mentioned this as well, is pricing greenhouse gas pollution. So our national price on carbon, as well as provincial frameworks, not only disincentivize fossil fuel use and greenhouse gas pollutants, but through offset regulations and programs, create an investable vehicle for nature-based solutions. And the outcome of that is good for people and nature. The Great Bear Rainforest carbon projects, for example, were partly driven because the BC government set emissions reductions targets and created a market that First Nations could then develop and sell offset credits. And they're using those revenues to support community development, but also environmental stewardship and cultural continuity. Also, as part of that, really important was government-to-government negotiations to establish who had the rights to those carbon benefits so that they could then be traded. So that's one example where Canada's leading the way. There's other regulatory frameworks around clean water and biodiversity protection that we can draw on from other regions too. I think the government also has a really important role to play on developing that pipeline of projects to service these markets. So here incentives can play a very big role. Incentive programs can reduce barriers to entry, reduce switching costs and risks, reward early adopters, and help create the business case for investments. The government's new net zero accelerator program's a great example, as well as the current investments in forest industry transformation, the IFIT program, as well as the Canadian Agriculture Partnership CAP program. Great examples where these incentive programs could be leveraged to accelerate nature-based solutions. And the funding could be used for things like funding upfront capital costs, bridge funding for delayed return on investments, cost sharing, risk management and insurance, and technical support for building this pipeline of projects.
Thanks, Amanda. That's a great start. I was thinking about Karen Clark-Whistler's comment last session that voluntary commitments are great, but as she pointed out, regulated markets for carbon are 40 times larger than voluntary markets. I thought that was a great stat. The same is true for biodiversity markets. So having government regulations can help drive the demand that pulls private capital in. You also talked about First Nations and Indigenous partnerships. Maybe I'll shift it over to you, Mandy, to talk a little bit about that. From your experience, what role can government play in helping Indigenous communities develop conservation projects?
Thank you, Stuart. For us, I think in working on this file, which has been extremely long-term, it's been a number of years, we have faced so many barriers in trying to access funding. And that was one of the biggest driving forces for us. 10 years ago, there was not a lot of funding sources available. And for us, a lot of that funding went towards ensuring that we had technical capacity. We had a wealth of information where we were sitting with our traditional tallyman, land users. They were able to identify wildlife habitats, watersheds, areas of cultural value. But taking all of that information and kind of feeding it into a model was technical work that we had never really undertaken. So I'm very thankful that a lot of this work was done with our NCC partner, and at very little to no cost for us, which this would not have made our protected areas a success. So I think that ensuring that there's funding sources available and removing those barriers to accessing those sources are the biggest things that you can follow if you want to ensure that First Nations are able to set aside key areas of their traditional territories for protection. In addition, I think right now when I'm looking at the type of funding sources that are available, a lot of them are for the establishment of protected areas, but we don't see a lot of long-term funding for the management of those protected areas. Ideally, we hope that the Cree territory that we've set aside for protection and conservation is going to be an area that we can use as a tourism, that we really want to showcase the beauty of our traditional territories with little to no impact, but trying to find funding for, the needs of employment, of park management, of, all of the different types of cultural programming that we want to run in those areas has been quite a challenge. So I think that for us, really looking at the type of funding that's available and trying to ensure that when you're looking at funding specifically for Indigenous people, that you're not looking at a blanketed approach. Indigenous territories vary. They're within so many different parts of Canada that I think you have to really ensure that when you're planning for this funding, that it does have a component of individualized approach, because needs can vary so greatly. The role and the use of what protected areas are for are very different for different nations. So I think there has to be that understanding that if you're going to be working with First Nations in Canada, that you have to really be aware that each reason that drives their protection is very specific to who they are, to what their cultural practices are, to what their traditional territories look like. And, most importantly, I think one of the things that we have to keep in the forefront of our minds is that we have to have sustainable financial solutions, that financing is always going to be available, and the key to that is creating employment that's linked to those sustainable funding solutions, and that employment is continuously available for the nation. And that's really going to ensure a successful long-term management of the protected area.
Yeah, those are great insights. Just one quick follow-up from Amanda talked about Great Bear, and one of the important things there was that the First Nations were able to share in the carbon offset revenues from conservation. I know in Canada in particular, where the vast majority of our lands are public lands and not private, and First Nations and Indigenous groups are part of all those publics. Is that a big factor too? Because First Nations certainly can share in timber or resource economic benefits when lands are developed. Is sharing in the conservation revenues going to be a big part of the success formula?
I think it depends on the type of market that you're involved in, because for us, of course, we're setting aside territories that are extremely large carbon sinks. It would be very rewarding for carbon projects to be undertaken in our territory. We have different types of landscape, from peat to wetlands to, old growth forest, and a lot of these are significant carbon sinks in Quebec. But right now, being able to get within a system that sells carbon credits has been extremely challenging because of the fact that for us, it's hard to access here in Quebec. In addition, I think that we always have to remember that, a lot of the territory that we set aside was prime conservation areas. And, in some of these spaces, they did not pose a lot of risk. And a lot of times when you're entering into a carbon project, you're choosing to eliminate that risk and undertaking a carbon project in lieu of the extraction of what that resource would mean. So we don't always fit within the criteria, but I do think that if there is a carbon project within Quebec, it should really target and allow for these spaces that have been set aside to be part of the program in some way. What that means, what kind of terms those are, I'm not sure, but I do think that it has to be reviewed and taken into consideration.
Thanks, Mandy. So, Craig, from the insurance industry perspective, what are the main kinds of things governments can do to make resilience projects investable for your industry and the communities you work with?
Well, governments, to start with, can act as first movers through their insurance procurement policies. That's one area. 70 years ago, urban fire was the greatest threat to communities, and insurers worked with local governments to devise ways to reward the construction of fire stations. And we all wear seatbelts now due to insurance incentives introduced in the 1960s and 70s. So we're in a sort of same place when it comes to flood and nature. Now that flood risk is escalating rapidly given climate change, governments and insurers can leverage insurance contracts to incent flood resilience, and that should include rewarding the conservation and restoration of nature. Secondly, governments can also provide seed funding to establish the partnering mechanisms that we need to flow blended finance. One of the key instruments that we're looking at with our work with Swiss Re here in Canada is the construction of flood management trusts that could purchase insurance contracts that provide financial resilience to downstream beneficiaries while flowing blended funds to acquire, maintain, and restore natural assets upstream. But you need that central mechanism. There's a gap in governance here, and governments could work to help seed the funding and create those entities such as flood management trusts.
And just building on Amanda's point, Craig, what about in terms of flood control, regulatory mandates to have no net loss of wetlands, things like that? Would that help to create some of the financial incentive to do this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, regulatory policies such as no net loss policies help in that, these issues are best tackled at scale. From an insurer perspective, we'd rather be addressing a series of wetlands, for instance, around the Greenbelt in Toronto or around the periphery of Ottawa, where wetlands around Ottawa mitigate about 10% of flood risk, according to the conservation authorities in the area. And we'd rather be addressing them as a whole, systemically, rather than just picking one or the other. It's much easier to attract private finance at scale that way, and it's much easier to design, an insurance framework that we've been looking at if you're looking at the whole thing together.
Okay, thanks. Rob, I'll invite you to chime in about things government can do, but also it's important to have standards and frameworks to ensure that these conservation projects are credible for investors. So maybe can you talk a bit about those things from your experience?
Yeah. Yes. Thanks, Stuart. Certainly, from a government perspective, I think Amanda's covered this pretty well. But the price signal is so important to catalyze markets. So we're seeing that in the carbon market right now, and we're seeing an uptick in the voluntary market and prices of voluntary credits, as well as sort of what people are expecting in terms of a regulatory market. So that's a really strong point. But it is important, critically important, that third-party standards be applied on projects so that there is some independent verification, independent auditing, and more importantly, some sort of common frameworks that we can start to measure and compare claims and outcomes across. So certainly that's fairly well developed in the carbon space. There's several international voluntary carbon standards. There are some beyond carbon standards that look at biodiversity, and some that are now looking even at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So it's really important from a credibility perspective that it's not just us saying these are what the outcomes are, it's having sort of independent audits claim that. It protects both the buyers as well as the sellers and all the intermediaries as well, right? So I'd really underscore the importance of third-party standards.
And Rob, one of the questions I hear from a lot of people is that doing some of those additional CCBA or Plan Vivo or gold standard biodiversity elements into carbon offsets takes more time and costs more money. You know that from Darkwoods, obviously. Is it worth it? Like, can you actually get a premium price for putting all that extra effort into generating an offset credit? Because if you can't, it's going to be hard to finance these things.
Yeah, great question. I think we are seeing a bit of a premium. Darkwoods is a good example where we're certified against the verified carbon standard. We're certified against the climate community and biodiversity standard, which measures biodiversity co-benefits. But we've just recently done the sustainable development standard as well. And we are seeing a little bit of a price premium in that, and that we were being incentivized to do that by some of our corporate buyers. But even more importantly, Stuart, I think, is that our mission is conservation first. So carbon is one of the ways we can help further conservation. So I think it's incumbent on us as practitioners to continuously up our game so that we continuously improve the way we approach these projects and put conservation first and use these as tools to help us get more done, whether it's by way of protection and restoration projects. So.
Okay. Let me dive into the weeds a little bit. In preparing for this session, one of the things that all of you talked about was the importance of data, technology, and technical issues in actually making projects credible. So maybe we'll sort of stick to a couple of key points each, but maybe I'll start with Craig. In terms of the conservation projects you work on, what are the kind of needs for data to make these projects real and investable?
So there's actually two areas to focus on here in answer to your question. One is before talking about data, we need to be focusing on valuation frameworks. That's our biggest challenge. Is how do you actually value price? How are you going to go about doing that if you're going to be creating a framework to invest in nature protection? We've got some good innovative efforts in Canada in that regard. We've got the Sustainable Asset Valuation, or SAVI methodology that IISD has developed. We've got the work of the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative. In particular, we're looking at the way they valued the White Tower Park ponds in Gibsons, BC for flood management. And you've also got the Credit Valley Conservation Authority's risk and return on investment tool. So there's some good work on valuation, but that's the central piece that we're sort of zeroing in on from an insurance industry perspective. And then, no matter which valuation model you take, typically you're looking at a blend of hydrological modeling data if you want to deal with flood. So how much storage can a wetland provide given varying intensity, duration, frequency of, or IDF curves of precipitation events? And combined with financial modeling data. So what are the exposed values of properties in the floodplain downstream, for instance? So the important thing to note is we've got all this. We actually have the financial data that we can combine with the hydrological data, with the ecological data. We have a lot of this. We just haven't organized and pulled it together and really had the convening discussions, place-based convening discussions that we need to come up with a valuation system and the data, put it together under some sort of entity to apply it.
That's interesting. So both ecological and financial data. Amanda, maybe just shifting to you, in your work internationally and in Canada, what have you found, not just about data needs, but about some of the innovative technologies that can help us to understand the ecological and financial values for these projects?
Yeah, great segue from what Craig was just talking about. So there's the raw data, and then there's the technology and the platforms that we can use to synthesize that data, aggregate it, and get it into the hands of project developers or investors. And so by way of a couple examples, Nature United, our global affiliate, has launched a couple initiatives. One is the Sustainability Accelerator, where it's investing in new technologies to help save the planet, as well as specific investments in agri-tech companies. And so a couple examples that are especially facilitating regenerative agriculture practices. One company, Nori, has built a digital marketplace, and it's connecting buyers with projects. And I know there's a few models like that out here. Nori's unique. It's using blockchain technology and a distributed ledger to track these, ensure there's no double counting, et cetera. And I think this kind of relates to stuff Eric was talking about this morning with his group. Another really cool example is Growers Edge. It's an intelligence platform. They're using sophisticated data science and algorithms, and they're designing warranty-backed crop risk management plans. And so they're helping with the risk reduction for farmers, as well as accelerating regenerative ag practices. Another venture, Propagate Ventures, is really focused on the agroforestry potential, which is a great opportunity integrating trees into croplands, provides new revenue streams, reduces carbon, increases resiliency. And that model is really cool because they're helping with the upfront economic analysis, with actual project implementation, and then also identifying financial investment tools. So kind of a full suite. And then there's other examples like this one company, Kula Bio, and they're actually developing biological nitrogen fertilizer alternatives, which reduce emissions and can save farmers on their bottom line. So there's this whole suite of technology that in and of themselves are investable opportunities. And I think it's interesting that when we're looking at attracting private capital, actually that investment could be in the technology itself. And so instead of investing in a single restoration project, investing in the technology that's going to enable hundreds of restoration projects.
I think we've just lost Stuart. We promised you there'd be technical glitches, and indeed there are. You know what? Why don't we start with some of the questions that are coming in from our audience at the moment, and let you kind of, toss them up and down in terms of who wants to answer each question, and I'm sure Stuart will log on while we're chatting. First question, how do the panelists respond to Minister Wilkinson's assertion that incentives to protect intact landscapes are different from those relevant in the managed landscape and more challenging and should be considered separately? Who wants to take that one?
Oh, well, I was going to reference that in my final remarks. Even though I just spoke, I'd love to take it on.
Why don't you start by taking it on, Amanda?
I think that there's a lot of truth and wisdom in Minister Wilkinson's remarks. It's not exactly the dichotomy that I would choose versus protection versus restoration, but I definitely think when we look across the suite of protect, manage, and restore across different types of pathways in specific places across Canada, market solutions are more appropriate for certain pathways in certain areas. And this is, Mandy was kind of alluding to this as well. And so I think that tailoring these investable solutions where the data is there, the metrics are there, the price point is lower, those are really great pathways to be working on some of these solutions. In other areas that it just doesn't work, and in a lot of cases those are protected area, larger intact protected areas in the north, or but it's not always protection versus restoration, but there certainly are circumstances where markets just aren't ready or the data is not ready, and really we should be investing good old conservation dollars in protecting those resources.
Anybody want to comment?
Thank you. Yeah, I would add that from a private market perspective, sometimes it's easier to draw investment into the creation or restoration of something than in maintaining it. And so, as we've been working on the insurance frameworks in Canada, rehabilitating or restoring wetlands on agricultural land where it's been drained is somewhat of an easier proposition to quantify and to reward than to avoid the development of a wetland that already exists, which requires acquisition dollars up front, and frankly is probably a better suited to in many cases to public financing. So yeah, I would definitely agree that the approaches are different depending on whether it's conservation or restoration.
Okay, I'm going to go on to question 2. Oh, sorry, Rob, did you have a comment there?
Underscore, I think it's really important, though, that we recognize the private land base may lend itself more to private investment to some extent than the Crown land base. But certainly, this issue of avoided emissions being critically important to maintain carbon sinks, as well as removals. So by protecting these, intact landscape, we protect not only the carbon that's stored there, but the ability to continue to sequester carbon. So we really do need both. And it may take different types of financial instruments to do both, but they're both important. So just wanted to underscore that.
Okay. And it may take a little while for Stuart to join us because apparently power's gone out with at his home. So we'll just keep on going. How's that? Next question I have, can you speak to the challenges in terms of the timing of funding a project? Large sums of money are needed upfront to protect a property to begin restoring a property, while benefits often accrue over a longer time, for example, as a forest grows, right? So what are some of the models that could work to overcome this challenge? So you're all thinking about it. Who wants to jump in?
I'll jump in on one.
I can try.
Oh, sorry, Mandy.
Thank you, Rob. I just wanted to address this because it was one of the things that we encountered when we were very fortunate to be selected for the Challenge Fund. We had a lot of funding that came in. It was broken down into percentages that were a little bit hard for us to meet. And then, of course, we had the double boom of being hit with COVID. And we were not able to undertake a lot of the work that we had scheduled for the first and second years of our project. In a way, I think it was kind of like a hidden benefit because it did allow for us to move funding around and to be able to carry over dollars and kind of compound the financial efforts that we were going to put towards other components in our project. So it is, I think, when you are creating funding opportunities that you have to take into consideration what I had mentioned, that it has to be almost a tailored approach to each Indigenous nation's project, and to kind of have a little bit of leniency and flexibility in the percentages of funding distribution. The targets that you set sometimes can be completely out of line with the goals of what the project is. So I think that's something that's really important to be reviewed when you're planning on distributing funding. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. Anybody else wanted to comment on this one?
Yeah, maybe I make a couple of comments just because, when you're acquiring large-scale projects, you do require a significant upfront funding, and that is difficult to source. So it's, one of the mechanisms that is being looked at is carbon is one of the obvious ways of trying to create a sustainable revenue stream on a landscape, and you could try to monetize that upfront and sell off that revenue stream to investors upfront to get some capital. Typically, though, there's always a hole. There's always a deficiency. It's not sufficient. So I kind of come back to also the first panel where they talked about still the importance of catalytic philanthropy or early stage investors that are willing to put capital at risk to help get projects underway. So if we take this kind of blended finance approach, we can look at a variety of investors that will commit capital with different return requirements. So that's one sort of blended finance approach to trying to think about that.
Good. Thank you. Next question. The viewer writes, I was struck by Karen Clark Whistler's comments, so in our first panel today, that we need to develop a consistent set of principles and criteria for nature-based solutions in order to scale up to global markets. Any further thoughts on where we are on this front and what we need to do?
Well, I spoke in my opening remarks about the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. We do need standardized approaches to valuation in to some regard. We need to have standardized approaches and taxonomy that are respected by the and understood by the investment community if we're going to be attracting private investment dollars. And that's why, we believe that, the work of a global effort such as CCRI is so important, and why it's been so important for Canada to join that conversation and help contribute to it. So that would be our take.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I think at the principles level as well, even maybe taking it up a step higher, we really, from the environmental conservation perspective, we really need to take an and approach. And so there is a lot of sometimes uncertainty around nature-based solutions, or if we put too much attention on nature-based solutions, will we take the pedal off of reducing fossil fuel? And so I think that we can address some of that at the principle level, that we do nature-based solutions in conjunction with pricing carbon, reducing fossil fuel use, reducing the impacts that to nature itself. We also deploy nature-based solutions in a way that has biodiversity safeguards and economic safeguards, and agree on that set of principles that we're going to move full force forward with nature-based solutions, knowing we're going to safeguard biodiversity, and we're going to do all the other things and take that all of the above approach.
We've heard a lot about the upside of offsets for conservation financing. Are there any downsides? Is there possibility, for example, of disincentivizing direct GHG emission reductions?
Jane, maybe I'll take one crack at that. There is ways of doing that, and it's important that we don't do that. So one of the things we do, it's really helpful, is follow the mitigation hierarchy. So certainly when we as NCC are selling offsets from the Darkwoods project, we actually pre-qualify any buyer and have to be assured that they are following the principles of the mitigation hierarchy. And that really is that you avoid, minimize, restore, remediate, and what you can't avoid, what you can't minimize, what you can't restore, then you go to offsets. So it's really important that people just don't gravitate to offsets in order to avoid undertaking actions that reduce their emissions first. They ought not to be doing that anyway, economically, one would hope. But it's a pretty good principle to follow, I think, that we want to make sure that that's kind of the last piece you go to.
Anybody else want to comment? No? Okay. I think Stuart had left you with one last challenge. So if he were here, he would ask you, right? What is the single most important thing that Canada must do to unleash financing to support nature conservation and restoration? And I'm just going to ask you for, as they used to call it on Jeopardy, the short snappers, right? The short answer at the end. So the single most important thing that Canada can do to unleash finance for restoration.
Jane, you need to tell us what order we're going in.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Whoever wants to jump in. You know what, Rob? You kick off, and then we'll go Rob, Mandy, Craig, and Amanda.
Sure.
Sorry.
Sure. I think, one of the things that's going to be really important is we talk about data, but the importance of getting good data across the country, whether that's carbon mapping, whether it's flood risk mapping, high conservation value mapping, but ways of trying to create data that we can monitor over time and then start to report on outcomes to investors. We need to align investor expectations with our ability to deliver outcomes. So I think that's really important. And that would be, the government can certainly be of assistance in helping create those data sets to help us across the country. That's one place. So Amanda, I think it was you.
Mandy. Yeah, Mandy, your thoughts.
Yeah, Mandy? Okay. Thank you. I think for me, the biggest mechanism that they can create is for it to be legally binding, to ensure that, not only industry, but society as a whole has to commit a certain component of either their revenue or their operating budgets towards initiatives that are put in place for protection and conservation. I really believe that we are at that point where we now have to make these kinds of attitudes and behaviors mandatory. In addition, I would love to see recognition for the work that has been put in place. A lot of Indigenous groups have committed to these large-scale projects, have set aside territories. They do not qualify for carbon, but I do believe that they should be compensated for their efforts because it is an ongoing project that they've committed to for long periods of time. And of course, most importantly, I think committing to UNDRIP and recognizing the role that First Nations have here in Canada, especially when undertaking conservation and protection of the environment. I think that there is a very large capacity and a very large pool, wealth of knowledge that Indigenous people have, and it can contribute significantly towards the conservation efforts that are being undertaken.
Thank you, Mandy. Craig?
So I would answer quickly that we've had a national debate here in Canada about how to price carbon, how to price emissions reduction, and we actually have a framework, hopefully, now agreed upon about how we're going to do that. Certainly, there's been tremendous thought leadership in that area. We're not there with regards to pricing climate resilience, pricing climate risk, or the area known as PCRs, and this is an area that has to be addressed in Canada, is how we're going to do a better job of coming up with that framework, because we need a standard framework for pricing resilience, pricing climate risk, if we're then going to be able to invest in addressing that risk. And that includes nature-based investments.
And take it home, Amanda.
And I am going to think big. I think that Canada should take the $4 billion investment that the federal government has made into natural climate solutions. We should collectively increase that ambition to $10 billion and then look to the corporate sector, Crown governments, Indigenous and governments, NGOs, and philanthropy, and look at how we're going to attract that capital and then deploy it. And that would include things like finishing the offset regulation and protocols to drive that capital market, developing incentive programs, investing in data and research, and developing big public-private finance vehicles for protection of natural areas.
Thank you so much. Amanda Reed, Craig Stewart, Mandy Gull, Rob Wilson, thanks for joining us and sharing your passions and your knowledge on this panel. Thank you, Stewart, wherever you are. We really appreciate all the work you did bringing this panel together. It's been tremendous. And thank you, I'll say thank you to the four of you for having the patience with your substitute moderator in the last 10 minutes.
Thank you for jumping in.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Jane.
There you go.
Thank you.
And that's all the time we have for questions today. If we didn't get to your question, our apologies. We asked as many questions as we possibly could, but we will continue to give your questions to the participants today, so you may hear back from them in terms of a response. If you have something else you would like to ask of us, please reach out to us. events@natureconservancy.ca. That's events@natureconservancy.ca. And now for a few concluding remarks, I'd like to pass it back over to our President and CEO, Catherine Grenier, who I know has been standing by and listening to all these sessions quite intently. Catherine?
Thank you very much, Jane. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope, like me, you're inspired by today's conversation. Although we're all virtual, I could sense the enthusiasm for many hours of what could sometimes be painful through these virtual meetings, but it really gives me lots of hope. I'm seeing convergence of ideas and determination across sector. And we had today quite a range of partners, and really we could see the same thing, same themes come in over and over again. We're getting a real sense of the joint imperative that we have for biodiversity and climate change, and how the task is huge. The time is now. we have no alternatives, and we all need to work together. No one size approach will fit all, but all sectors need to collaborate because the task at hand is just too big to consider just one sector. We also need to do it alongside with Indigenous people in order to be successful. Some of the key things I heard is how, from Minister Wilkinson, Canada must lead the way, how government's prepared to support, but how the task at hand is just too big. Government alone can't do it. How we need involvement, creativity of the private sector. We need to influence new ideas and push the boundaries. I heard from Carney a great message about ambition and opportunity that needs to be seized. The panels highlighted really good example of how it could be done, but also the gaps that are required for us to scale up. And when I'm thinking away of what needs to be done next, there's a couple of good sentences that were highlighted by some of the panelists. But one of the first thing was the importance of shared goals, how we need to basically speak the same language. I think current Clark Whistler highlighted that for us, how we need across sector to share the same business drivers. And I think today we sort of had that, right? The business drivers are quite clear. The timeline is clear. Then how do we speak in a ways that all stakeholders see the value and can value the benefits associated with our work? Three key things for me that I think are important in terms of next steps, and I'm sure we're going to continue and have the conversation around that. The first one is better metrics, so we could facilitate reporting on outcomes. The second one is how we could establish more cost-effective and more readily available projects. I think there was a lot of discussion about the different geography, different types of project, the private lands versus crown lands, restoration versus protecting intact. I think we need to get ready to be able to have some project ready. And of course, the third one, it goes hand in hand with government support. Amanda talked about funding, but how we also need to have to build and expand the policy framework so that we could scale up private participation. So that brings the session to an end today. Thank you all for your to all of our participants, moderator, guest speakers. I hope you appreciated the brain power that was in the conversation today. Your words enlightened us. Your experience inspired all of us, and your ideas really energized us. I think we're all walking out of these sessions thinking, we got to do something here. So thank you for sharing your time, your optimism, and your passion. Thank you very much to the NCC team for putting together such a great list of conversations. Thank you again to our sponsors, the Packard Foundation and TD Ready Commitment. At a time when we all feel the distance, your generosity has brought together a community to learn from each other. So today doesn't mark the end of our conversation. What really excites us as NCC is that so many organizations and leaders are keenly working in this space. In fact, if you'd like to learn a little more, our friends at the Conference Board of Canada have an additional webinar on financing and accounting for nature-based solution next week, May 19th. And for NCC, we're committed to advancing work on nature-based solution. We've set ambitious targets for ourselves. To get great conservation done, we're keen to find those new mechanisms to grow private sector support. And to help us get there, we just launched Nature plus Climate Project Accelerator. This will be our new hub for talent, innovation, and action. The accelerator will focus its energies on developing and implementing a pipeline of projects to deliver conservation and climate benefits. And the accelerator will also be a resource center. So I invite you to keep an eye on our website and watch for invitation for future events this fall. Supporting nature, supporting the work of the Nature Conservancy of Canada is a tangible way to take action. I think we've said it over and over. We need everyone to be involved in order to tackle this big challenge. When conservation becomes a way of life, it benefits all life. So thank you very much for being part of Making Nature Investable. We look forward to joining you again soon. And Jane, back to you.
Thank you, Catherine. That just leaves about 15 seconds for me to do a little bit of the housekeeping as we close off. A recording of today's event will be sent to you on May 14th, sent to all people who registered for this summit. In a few weeks' time, you'll also receive a written proceedings report from today's discussions, which we hope will help you seed many more conversations along the way. For updates on future nature-based solutions projects and events at NCC, you can visit us at natureconservancy.ca/NBS. And on behalf of the Nature Conservancy of Canada, enjoy the rest of your day, stay safe, and this ends the live stream. Thank you.